She laughed at him. Not a polite smile, not a quiet smirk behind closed doors. She laughed, openly, carelessly, at the man standing in front of a rusted shop sign in a faded work shirt, grease under his fingernails, a child's crayon drawing visible through the office window behind him. She had no idea that man held 17 patents, that he had written the report that could have saved her company 3 years before she ever needed saving, that the abandoned factory her executives dismissed as worthless was about to become the thing that brought her empire to its knees. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Isabella Sterling laughed at Ryan Holloway, he had already been awake for 4 hours. That was normal for him, had been for years. By 5:15, he'd packed Emma's lunch. Peanut butter, no jelly, because she'd decided 2 months ago that jelly was, in her exact words, slimy and suspicious. He'd ironed her school shirt, the small blue one with the butterfly on the pocket that she insisted on wearing 3 times a week. He'd braided her hair badly, the way he always did, and she'd looked at it in the bathroom mirror and said, "Daddy, it looks like a pretzel that gave up." He'd laughed at that. A real laugh. The kind that only happens before the rest of the world wakes up and starts asking things of you. By 6:30, Emma was on the school bus. By 6:45, Ryan was at the shop. Holloway Machine Repair sat on the corner of Decker Avenue and Route 9 in Millhaven, Ohio. A mid-sized town that had once been the kind of place where people built things with their hands and took pride in it. Most of that industry was gone now. The plants had closed or moved. The people who stayed either adapted or got quiet. Ryan had done both. The shop itself was not impressive by any reasonable standard. The sign out front had faded from navy blue to a washed-out gray blue that looked almost lavender in certain afternoon light. The parking lot was cracked asphalt patched with concrete that didn't quite match. There were 2 bays, a small office with a window that fogged in winter and stuck in summer, and a back room that functioned simultaneously as a parts storage area, a filing room. And, on 2 separate occasions when Emma had a fever and he couldn't find a sitter, a makeshift sickbay with a fold-out cot and a portable DVD player. It wasn't much to look at. Ryan had never cared about what it looked like. He cared about what came through the door. He was in the middle of rebuilding a hydraulic actuator from a packaging line, a job that most repair shops in a 3-county radius had turned down as too complex. When his phone rang at 9:42 that Tuesday morning, the number was from Columbus. He didn't recognize it. "Holloway Repair," he answered, cradling the phone between his ear and shoulder while wiping hydraulic fluid off his hands with a rag that had long since ceased to be clean. "Yes. Is this Ryan Holloway?" The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, carrying the particular brand of impatience that belongs to people who schedule their impatience in 15-minute increments. "Speaking. This is Marcus Webb, Operations Director for Sterling Industrial Group. We have a situation at our Millhaven production facility. Line 4 is down completely. We've been told you handle industrial machinery repair." Ryan set the rag down. "What's Line 4 running?" "Precision stamping, aerospace-grade component fabrication. The line went down at 6 this morning, and we cannot identify the fault. Our internal team has been on it for almost 4 hours." Ryan was quiet for a moment. He knew Sterling Industrial's Millhaven plant, knew it better than Marcus Webb probably realized. "What's your production deadline?" "We have a partial shipment due Thursday. If the line doesn't come back online by tomorrow night, we breach contract. That's—" Webb paused, and Ryan could hear the effort it took the man to say the next part. "That's a significant exposure." "I can be there in an hour," Ryan said. "Send me whatever diagnostic data your team has pulled so far." There was a pause. "You want the diagnostic data?" "The fault codes, the pressure readings from the last 48 hours, the maintenance log if you have it digitized. Email it to the address on our website." Another pause, longer this time. Ryan could almost hear Webb recalibrating his expectations of who he'd called. "I'll have it sent over," Webb said. Ryan hung up, looked down at the actuator on his workbench, and covered it carefully with a cloth. He'd come back to it tonight, probably after Emma was in bed. He changed his shirt, grabbed his diagnostic case, and locked the shop. The Sterling Industrial Plant on Commerce Boulevard was the kind of facility that announced itself before you arrived. The building was massive, 200,000 square feet of manufacturing floor, a glass and steel administrative building grafted onto the front like a corporate face over an industrial body. The company's logo, a stylized silver S above the word Sterling, was mounted in brushed metal letters 4 feet tall above the entrance. Ryan pulled into the visitor parking area in his truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it and a cracked dashboard that he'd been meaning to fix for approximately 2 years. He grabbed his case from the back seat and walked toward the entrance. He was aware of how he looked. He always was. 32 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that comes from spending years actually doing physical work rather than talking about it. His hair needed cutting. His boots were clean but old. He was wearing his better work shirt, a dark charcoal button-down that he reserved for client meetings. But it was still a work shirt. He looked like what he was, a man who fixed things for a living in a mid-sized Ohio town that most people drove through on the way to somewhere else. The woman at the reception desk looked up when he came through the glass doors. "Ryan Holloway," he said. "Marcus Webb called me about line 4. She checked her screen, nodded, and called back to operations. While he waited, Ryan looked at the lobby. On the wall to his left was a large framed photograph of the company's founder, Harold Sterling, Isabella's grandfather, standing in front of the original Sterling plant in 1968. Next to it was a more recent photo, Isabella at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the company's new European distribution center. She was smiling in that photo the way people smile when photographers are present and the lighting is good. Marcus Webb appeared through a side door. He was tall, late 40s, with the look of someone who had navigated corporate politics long enough that navigating had become its own kind of exhaustion. He looked at Ryan, took in the truck through the lobby window, and his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Ryan caught it. "Mr. Holloway." They shook hands. "Thanks for coming out. I have to be honest with you. We've got our best people on this already. We were hoping you might offer a secondary perspective." "Secondary perspective." Ryan filed that away. "Walk me through the layout," Ryan said. "I'll take a look at what your team has." They moved through the facility. The manufacturing floor was impressive. Modern equipment, well organized, the kind of plant that had been built or significantly upgraded in the last decade. Line 4 was at the back, surrounded by a cluster of engineers and technicians who had the particular look of smart people who had been staring at a problem long enough that they'd stopped seeing it clearly. Ryan was introduced to the lead engineer, a man named Darren Kowalski, who shook his hand with barely concealed skepticism. Kowalski was probably 45, with a master's degree hanging somewhere in his history and the confidence of someone who'd been the smartest person in the room for most of his career. "We've checked the servo controllers, the hydraulic pressure regulators, the stamping die alignment," Kowalski said, pointing at a tablet showing diagnostic readouts. "Everything tests within spec." "Can I see the maintenance log for the last 90 days?" Ryan asked. Kowalski hesitated, then handed over a tablet. Ryan scrolled through it. He was quiet for almost 3 minutes, which seemed to make several people in the group visibly uncomfortable. "Who serviced the primary timing synchronizer 6 weeks ago?" Ryan asked without looking up. Kowalski exchanged a quick look with one of the junior technicians. "Outside contractor. We had our regular maintenance vendor out sick." Ryan handed the tablet back. He crouched down next to the base of the line's central drive assembly, pulled out a flashlight and shone it into a gap between 2 housing panels that were not, technically, supposed to be accessed during routine diagnostics. He saw it immediately. He stood up. "Your timing synchronizer was reinstalled with the calibration offset rotated 4 degrees. It's been running at that offset for 6 weeks. It finally accumulated enough thermal stress to cause the drive coupling to microfracture. The line didn't fail this morning. It's been failing slowly since March." Silence. Kowalski stared at him. That's not in any of the diagnostic protocols." "No," Ryan agreed. "It wouldn't be. The protocols assume the synchronizer is correctly installed." He'd been working on the line for about 40 minutes, had pulled the necessary components, identified the specific microfracture pattern, and was explaining the repair sequence to Kowalski's team when Isabella Sterling arrived. Ryan heard her before he saw her. There was a particular shift in the atmosphere of the room, the kind that happens when someone important walks in and everyone who works for them unconsciously recalibrates their posture. He was on one knee next to the drive assembly when she came through the floor entrance with Webb and 2 other people he didn't recognize, corporate by the look of them. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, her dark hair pulled back, moving through the manufacturing floor with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd grown up learning to be comfortable in spaces like this. She was, objectively, a striking person. Not in a magazine cover way, but in a more specific way. She had the kind of presence that fills a room without announcing itself. The kind that comes from years of walking into difficult situations and not looking like they're difficult. Ryan registered all of this in about 2 seconds and then went back to what he was doing. He heard Webb speaking quietly to her near the entrance, presumably explaining the situation. Then he heard footsteps approaching. "This is the repair technician?" Isabella's voice. "Ryan Holloway," Webb said. "He identified the fault about 40 minutes ago. Small outfit, local, but apparently—" "How long until the line is back up?" she said directly to Ryan now. He looked up at her. 3 hours. Maybe 3.5. She studied him for a moment. The crouched position, the worn boots, the diagnostic case with its scuffed corners, the F150 visible through the floor's side window. Ryan watched something move across her face. It was quick. She caught it almost immediately and smoothed it back into professional neutrality. But he'd seen it. That particular expression, the one that says this is who they sent, was something Ryan had seen enough times in his life that he could recognize it from across a room in bad lighting. She hadn't meant for him to see it. She probably didn't even fully register that she'd made it. That almost made it worse. 3 hours, she repeated. Yes. She nodded once, turned to Webb. Keep me updated, she said, and walked toward the administrative building. Marcus Webb had watched the exchange. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Ryan turned back to the drive assembly and got back to work. He finished in 2 hours and 50 minutes. Line 4 came back online at 1:47 in the afternoon. Kowalski's team ran the diagnostic sequence, confirmed the timing synchronizer was properly calibrated, and watched the line cycle through its startup sequence without a fault code. Kowalski shook Ryan's hand, and there was nothing performative about it this time. "I've been in this industry for 20 years, he said quietly. "I would not have found that." "You would have," Ryan said. "Eventually. Not before Thursday." Ryan packed his case. Webb appeared to process payment, a flat rate that Ryan had quoted over the phone, which Webb had clearly expected to negotiate down and which Ryan had not budged on. The invoice was paid without discussion. As Ryan was walking toward the exit, he passed through the corridor that connected the manufacturing floor to the administrative lobby. The walls here were lined with framed company history, photos, patents, product milestones, press coverage. He stopped at one of the frames. It was a laminated copy of an industry trade magazine from 3 years ago. The headline read, "Sterling Industrial acquires decommissioned Millhaven facility. Future plans unclear." Below the headline was an aerial photograph of a large industrial property on the east side of town. A property that had been sitting empty for the better part of a decade. A property Ryan knew very well. He stood there for a moment, looking at the photo. Then he walked out to his truck, put his case in the back seat, and sat there in the parking lot for a minute before starting the engine. His phone buzzed. A text from the school. Bus delay. Pick up 4:15 instead of 3:45. He texted back, "Got it. I'll be there." He drove back to the shop. He had an actuator to finish. The thing about Ryan Holloway that almost nobody in Millhaven knew, and that he had no particular interest in publicizing, was that between the ages of 22 and 27, he had been considered one of the more promising young engineers in American industrial manufacturing. He hadn't gone to a famous school. He'd gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and a part-time job at a campus machine shop, and he'd graduated with a mechanical engineering degree and a restlessness that classroom learning had never quite satisfied. He'd gone to work for a mid-sized industrial firm in Cleveland straight out of college, and within 18 months he'd been working on projects that engineers twice his age were being assigned. He had a particular way of looking at mechanical systems, not as collections of parts, but as arguments. Every machine was making a claim about how it thought force, pressure, and motion should be managed. Ryan could read those arguments the way other people read text, and he could almost always find where the argument broke down. By 25, he had filed his first patent. By 27, he had 7 of them, and 3 had been licensed to manufacturers whose names appeared on the kind of equipment that ran in facilities like Sterling Industrial's Millhaven plant. He didn't advertise this. The licensing checks came in quarterly, direct deposit, into an account he'd had since college. Then, when he was 28, his wife Sarah had died. An accident. The kind that happens on a Tuesday afternoon in November when conditions are ordinary and the universe is not paying special attention. Emma had been 2 years old. Ryan had been in Cleveland in a meeting about a potential fourth licensing deal when his phone rang. He didn't go back to corporate engineering after that. He had a 2-year-old daughter who looked at him every morning with absolute trust, the kind of trust that doesn't understand why it should be complicated. And he made a decision. He came back to Millhaven, where his father had run a machine shop before his knees gave out, and he took over the lease on the Decker Avenue property. And he started over. The patents kept paying. He took on repair contracts because he was good at it, and because it kept him close to the work without requiring him to be anywhere that wasn't Millhaven, wasn't near Emma's school, wasn't within 20 minutes of everything that mattered to him now. He was not, by most external measurements, living up to his potential. He had made his peace with that, with what he had not made peace with, what he thought about sometimes, in the quiet hours after Emma was asleep and the shop was locked and the town had gone still, was a 47-page engineering report he'd written 3 years ago. The Millhaven East Industrial Facility had been built in 1974 to manufacture automotive transmission components. It had operated for 22 years before the company that owned it consolidated operations in Michigan and shut the Ohio plant down. It had changed hands twice since then, sat idle for the better part of a decade, and been acquired by Sterling Industrial Group 3 years ago under circumstances that were described in the press as strategic asset diversification. What this meant in practice was that Sterling had paid a reduced price for the land and building, assigned the property to a junior asset manager who added it to a portfolio of underperforming acquisitions, and essentially forgotten about it. Ryan had not forgotten about it. He had spent time in that building as a teenager, helping his father with a subcontract job when the facility was still operational. He remembered the layout. He remembered the bones of the place, the ceiling heights, the floor load capacity, the power infrastructure. Even abandoned, even deteriorating, he had walked through it twice in the years since Sterling acquired it, because the property was technically accessible if you knew which side entrance the lock had rusted open on. He had spent 4 months writing that report. It was not a casual document. It was 47 pages of structural analysis, manufacturing systems assessment, market opportunity modeling, and capital investment projection. He had calculated, conservatively, that the facility could be converted into a precision manufacturing plant capable of competing at a national level for aerospace and defense contracts, a segment of the market that was growing while traditional automotive manufacturing continued its slow contraction. The barriers to entry in aerospace component manufacturing were high. The tolerances required were extraordinary. Most facilities that tried to enter the segment failed within 3 years because the precision requirements exposed every weakness in their systems and their people. Ryan had also spent 4 months, in parallel with writing the report, designing those systems. Not in a theoretical way. In the way he designed things, which was the way you design something you were going to have to live with, accounting for the things that break, the people who get tired, the ways that good systems degrade under real-world pressure. He had sent the report to Sterling Industrial's corporate development office with a cover letter explaining who he was, what the report contained, and why he believed they were sitting on an asset that could be transformational. He had received, 8 weeks later, a 1-paragraph email from a coordinator in the corporate development department thanking him for his interest in Sterling Industrial's growth strategy, and informing him that his submission had been reviewed and would be kept on file for future consideration. He had not heard from them again. He had thought about it sometimes. Not with bitterness, exactly. Bitterness required a kind of sustained investment of energy that Ryan didn't have in the years when Emma was small and the shop needed building and life needed living. He thought about it the way you think about a road you didn't take, occasionally with something that wasn't quite regret but lived in the same neighborhood. He thought about it when he drove past the abandoned facility on his way to client calls and saw the weeds growing in the parking lot and the boards on the lower windows and the rust-forming slow flowers on the loading dock doors. He thought about it the day Isabella Sterling's operations director called his shop. He thought about it now, driving back to Decker Avenue with his diagnostic case in the back seat, the afternoon turning to early evening, the Ohio sky going the particular shade of pale orange that happened on clear days in May, when the light had some actual warmth to it. He thought about it, and then he thought about Emma, and then he thought about the actuator he needed to finish. One thing at a time. Emma was waiting on the front step of the school with her backpack that was decorated with iron-on patches. A dinosaur, a half-moon, a small red rocket ship that she'd picked out herself at the craft store and which Ryan had ironed on crooked the first time and had to redo. She stood up when she saw the truck and sprinted across the pickup circle in the way that 6-year-olds sprint, which is with their entire body and no plan. "Dad, Dakota said this bus smelled like cheese, and I said it always smells like cheese, and she said that was my fault because I had a cheese sandwich, and I said that was not fair because everyone has sandwiches." Ryan caught her mid-sprint and swung her up, backpack and all. "Was it your cheese?" She considered this seriously. "Maybe a little bit my cheese." He laughed and put her in the passenger seat, which she was technically too small for without the booster he'd left in the truck that morning, a fact she pointed out with significant satisfaction. "It's 4 blocks," he said. "Safety, Daddy." "You're right. I'm sorry." He retrieved the booster from behind the seat. She ate an apple on the drive back to the shop and talked about a book her class was reading about a girl who builds a robot, and whether Ryan thought a real robot could have feelings, and whether if it could have feelings, it would be sad when it got turned off. "That's a really good question," Ryan said. "What's the answer?" "I don't know." She processed this. "That's not really an answer." "No, but it's an honest one." She ate the rest of her apple in a considering silence that Ryan found, as he often did, quietly remarkable in a 6-year-old. That night, after Emma was asleep, she'd demanded 3 chapters of the robot book and then fallen asleep mid-sentence, the way kids do, like a light switch. Ryan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and the folder he kept in the second drawer of the filing cabinet in his office at the shop. He'd brought it home. Inside the folder was a copy of the 47-page report, a current property assessment he'd pulled from county records 6 months ago, and a series of handwritten notes that he'd been adding to intermittently for the last 2 years. Also in the folder was a business card. Martin Lau, it read. Below the name, a title, a phone number, and the address of a private equity firm in Columbus. Ryan had known Martin Lau for 9 years. They'd met at an industry conference when Ryan was 23 and Martin was 31 and already making the kind of moves that people in his world described as aggressive and meant as a compliment. They'd stayed in loose contact through the years. Martin had called when Sarah died. A call that had lasted 45 minutes and had been one of the few conversations during that period that Ryan had been able to get through without the numbness setting in. Martin had called last year about a different matter, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Ryan had mentioned the facility. Not seriously, not as a pitch, just as a thing he thought about. Martin had said, "Call me when you're serious." Ryan looked at the property assessment. The county records showed Sterling Industrial had let the tax assessment lapse twice in the last 3 years, a flag that suggested the asset was not a priority. He'd had a conversation with a commercial real estate broker 6 months ago, casually, without identifying himself, and had been told the property had not been listed, but that Sterling was theoretically open to offers based on back-channel conversations. He picked up his phone. It was 10:47 at night. He knew Martin would be awake. It rang twice. "Ryan," Martin's voice, alert, no grogginess. "It's late." "I know, I want to talk about the Millhaven facility." A pause. Not a surprised pause. The pause of someone who has been waiting for a particular call and is now deciding how to receive it. "Okay," Martin said. "Talk." Ryan talked for 40 minutes. He walked through the report, the market assessment, the capital requirements, his manufacturing systems design. He talked about the workforce, the former plant workers he knew, the ones still in the area who hadn't found stable work, the ones with the skills that were hard to find and harder to train. Martin asked 23 questions. Ryan had counted by the end, a habit from years of technical presentations. At the end, there was a long silence. "How much of your own capital are you bringing?" Martin asked. "Everything I have available, patent royalties, savings, equity in the shop. About 400,000 liquid. I can leverage the patent portfolio for another 150. "That's not enough for the acquisition and the build-out." "I know. That's why I'm calling you." Another silence. You've been sitting on this for 3 years, Martin said. What changed today? Ryan was quiet for a moment. I went to the Sterling facility today. Repair call. And? And nothing. And I drove past the East property on the way home. Martin made a sound that might have been a laugh. That's it? You drove past a building? Yeah. You didn't suddenly decide you needed to prove something? Didn't have some big moment? Ryan thought about Isabella Sterling's face, that quick, unguarded expression, gone before it fully arrived. No, he said. I just think it's the right move in the right time. The market's there. The facility's there. I can build this. Another silence. Then, I'll fly in Friday. Bring the full report and the system's design. Ryan exhaled. Thank you, Martin. Don't thank me yet. I'm coming to ask you hard questions. I know. And Ryan? A brief pause. You'd better be serious this time. I'm serious. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes with the cold coffee and the folder and the quiet of the house. From down the hall, he could hear the particular silence of a sleeping child. Not quite the same as ordinary silence, somehow fuller. He closed the folder. He thought about the weeds in the parking lot, the rust on the loading dock doors, the 47 pages that had been kept on file for future consideration. He thought about Kowalski shaking his hand. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer who had looked at his truck and made a face she didn't know he'd seen. He wasn't angry. That was the thing. He examined it carefully and found that what he felt wasn't anger, wasn't wounded pride, wasn't any of the things you'd expect. What he felt was something quieter than that and more purposeful. He was just going to build the thing. That was all. He went to bed at 11:15. He had an actuator to finish in the morning, and Emma needed her dinosaur backpack washed because Dakota had told her it smelled like cheese, and there was work to do. There was always work to do. Friday came, and Martin Lau drove from Columbus in a rented car and sat across from Ryan in the small office at Holloway Machine Repair in a chair that squeaked on one side, with bad coffee in a paper cup, and went through the 47-page report with the focused attention of someone who was deciding whether to trust a significant amount of money to a man he genuinely liked. It was not a comfortable meeting. Martin asked about capital cost overruns, labor market volatility, certification timelines for aerospace-grade manufacturing compliance, competitor analysis in 3 separate market segments, and what Ryan's exit strategy was if the build-out hit unexpected structural problems in the facility. Ryan answered every question. Not perfectly. Martin caught 2 assumptions in his market modeling that were optimistic and pushed back on them until Ryan revised the projections down to numbers that were less exciting and more defensible. Better, Martin said, making a note. It's less impressive. It's survivable. Impressive facilities that aren't survivable are just expensive failures. He turned a page. What about your workforce plan? Ryan slid a separate document across the desk. A handwritten list, 3 pages, with names and previous experience and current employment status. Martin looked at it. You already know who you're hiring. I know who I want. I haven't talked to anyone yet. Martin studied the list for a long moment. There's a woman on here. Patricia Owens, former quality control supervisor. Is she still in the area? She's working checkout at the grocery store on 3rd Street, Ryan said. She's been there for 2 years. Something shifted in Martin's expression. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. He spent another hour going through the system's design documentation, asking questions that got progressively more specific and progressively more impressed, even as he worked to keep the impression off his face. At the end, he sat back in the squeaking chair and looked at Ryan for a long moment. If we proceed, Martin said, I bring in my firm as minority equity partner. You retain operating control. Management decisions are yours. We agree on financial reporting structure and milestone benchmarks. Agreed. I'll also need the patent licensing agreements reviewed. We may be able to restructure some of those royalty flows to improve your capital position. I've thought about that. I'd want to keep the existing licensees whole. Those are relationships. Martin nodded, unsurprised. We can structure around that. He looked at the list of names again. This is a real thing, Ryan. Yeah. You understand it's going to be hard. Yes. You've got a 6-year-old. I know. Ryan said it steadily, without defensiveness. She's why I'm doing this in a way that doesn't fall apart. She's not a reason to think smaller. She's a reason to build it right. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd decided something. "I'll have the term sheet to you by Wednesday," he said. They shook hands. Emma had left a crayon drawing on the corner of the desk. A house, a figure with a large head that Ryan assumed was him, and what appeared to be a dog, though they didn't own a dog. Under the house, she had written, in large uneven letters, Holloway. Martin looked at it. "Nice dog." "We don't have a dog," Ryan said. "Maybe you should get one." Ryan looked at the drawing for a moment. Maybe. In the weeks that followed, Ryan moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been thinking about something long enough that the thinking and the doing were no longer different activities. The acquisition process for the Millhaven East facility took 11 weeks. Sterling Industrial's asset management division, confronted with a cash offer that reflected the true current value of a property they'd been paying taxes on without return for 3 years, agreed to terms with less resistance than Ryan had anticipated. He signed the purchase papers on a Thursday morning at a title company downtown. With Martin on the phone from Columbus and a closing attorney named Susan Yee, who specialized in commercial real estate and who asked Ryan twice at different points in the process whether he was certain he understood the scope of what he was acquiring. "I wrote a 47-page report about it," Ryan said. She looked at him. "Okay," she said, and kept going. He did not celebrate. He drove to the shop, finished a compressor repair for a client in Logan County who'd been waiting 2 weeks, picked Emma up from school, made pasta for dinner, read 4 chapters of the robot book because the chapter about the robot's first feelings was a cliffhanger, and Emma refused to stop there, and went to bed at 10:30. The next morning, he drove to the East facility with a key that was technically his. He stood inside the building alone for a long time. It was worse than he remembered. 3 years of abandoned industrial space had done what they do. Water infiltration in the northeast corner, significant corrosion on the overhead crane rails, sections of the concrete floor that had heaved and cracked, electrical systems that would need to be gutted and rebuilt from the panel in. It was a lot of work. Ryan walked the entire floor twice, making notes on a yellow legal pad, and then sat on a concrete step near the loading dock and looked at the space. It was also, still, exactly what he'd known it was. The bones were there. The ceiling height was right. The floor load capacity, once the damaged sections were repaired, was exceptional. The power infrastructure, once rebuilt, could support the equipment load his system's design required. He thought about Patricia Owens working checkout at the grocery store on 3rd Street. He thought about the list of names. He thought about aerospace tolerances and defense contracts, and a segment of the market that was growing while everyone else was contracting. He stood up, put the legal pad under his arm, and walked back out into the morning. He had phone calls to make. The first person Ryan called was Patricia Owens. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of the East facility, the legal pad on the seat beside him, the morning still cold enough that his breath fogged slightly against the windshield. He'd looked up her number through a mutual contact, a former plant worker named Dale Hutchins, who still lived 2 streets over from the facility, and who had, when Ryan called him the previous week to test the waters, said, "Patricia? She's running checkout at Bricker's, has been for 2 years. It's a crime, is what it is." The phone rang 4 times. Ryan was preparing for voicemail when she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was careful in the way people answer unknown numbers. Not unfriendly, just guarded. "Patricia, this is Ryan Holloway. I run the machine repair shop on Decker Avenue. You don't know me, but I know your work. Dale Hutchins gave me your number." A short pause. "Okay. I bought the East facility, the old transmission plant off Commerce." Longer pause. "You bought it?" "Yes. I want to talk to you about coming on as quality systems lead. It's not a conversation for the phone. I'd like to sit down with you if you're willing." The silence on her end was the particular kind that means a person is recalculating something. "When did you buy it?" "Signed Thursday." "And you're already calling people." "I've been thinking about this for 3 years," Ryan said. "I don't need more time to think." Another pause, and then something shifted in her voice. Some of the guard came down, not all of it, but enough. "I get off at 2 on Wednesdays." "Wednesday works. I'll come to you, wherever's convenient." "There's a diner on Marsh Street, Ronnie's. You know it?" "I'll find it." 2:30, she said. "I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking you to." He hung up and looked at the list. Dale Hutchins, former senior machinist, 21 years at the original plant, now doing part-time work at a lumber yard. Vic Caruso, CNC operator, precision tooling specialist, last known employment, a contract position that had ended 8 months ago. James Jimmy Park, hydraulic systems technician, the best Ryan had personally seen at a particular type of fault diagnosis that was both rare and essential for the kind of manufacturing Ryan was planning. Jimmy Park was currently working at a car wash on Route 9. Ryan knew this because Jimmy had come into the shop 6 months ago to ask about a job, and Ryan had said, with genuine regret, that he didn't have the volume to bring on another full-time person. Jimmy had nodded and said it was fine, and it hadn't been fine, and they'd both known it. Ryan called Jimmy next. Jimmy picked up on the first ring. "Mr. Holloway? Ryan, are you at work right now? Don't start for another hour. What's up?" "I want to offer you something better than the car wash." "A beat." "How much better?" "Considerably." Ryan named a figure, a salary, not a wage, benefits, a share in a profit participation structure he'd built into the business plan. He heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end. "That's—" Jimmy stopped. "That's real?" "I wouldn't call you about something that wasn't." "What's the catch?" "No catch. The work is hard. The standards are the highest you've ever worked to. If the line produces something that doesn't meet spec, we don't ship it and we don't argue about it." "I don't ship things that don't meet spec." "I know. That's why I'm calling you." Jimmy was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the particular quality of someone trying not to show how much something means to them. "When do you need an answer?" "Take the week," Ryan said. "Talk to your wife. Come see the facility on Saturday morning if you want. It's a construction zone right now, but you'll see what it's going to be." "I'll be there Saturday," Jimmy said. "I don't need the week." Ryan called 7 more people that week. 6 of them said yes before he'd finished explaining. One of them, a former line supervisor named George Tillis, who'd moved to Akron, asked for 2 weeks to think about it, and Ryan gave him the 2 weeks, and George called back in 4 days. The calls were not all easy. Some of the people on his list had settled into their current lives with the particular resignation of people who've learned not to want things that might not happen. A few of them needed convincing that he was serious, that this wasn't a development scheme that would fall through, that the capital was real, that the timeline was real. Ryan answered every question without impatience, which was sometimes harder than it sounded. Dale Hutchins cried on the phone, just briefly, and then cleared his throat aggressively and said, "Allergies," and Ryan said, "Of course," and they moved on. By the end of the second week, Ryan had the core of a workforce. What he didn't have was a functioning facility, $600,000 of renovation costs, a permitting process that Ohio's Industrial Zoning Board was approaching with the enthusiasm it typically reserved for things it intended to delay, and any meaningful sleep. He was also still running the shop on Decker Avenue. He did not close it. Martin had suggested, gently, that the repair business was a distraction at this point, and Ryan had said, less gently, that the shop had paid for Emma's preschool, her medical bills during a bad flu season 2 years ago when he'd been scared in a way he still didn't like to think about, and the down payment on the house. He was not closing the shop. He hired a part-time mechanic named Trevor, a 24-year-old who was better with electronics than he was with hydraulics, but who learned fast and showed up on time. And he shifted his own hours so that he was at the facility during the day and at the shop in the early morning and late afternoon. He slept approximately 5.5 hours a night for the better part of 4 months. Emma noticed. "Kids always notice? You look tired," she told him one morning in October, studying his face with the clinical frankness of a 7-year-old. She'd had a birthday while the renovation was underway. Ryan had taken a full Saturday off, completely off, and they'd gone to the Children's Museum in Columbus and eaten at a restaurant where the children's menu came with crayons, and Emma had drawn a picture of a factory on the back of hers and told the waitress that her dad owned it. "I am a little tired," Ryan admitted. "Are you going to the building again today?" "This morning, yes. Trevor's opening the shop. I'll be back by noon." She considered this. "Is it going to be good? The building?" He looked at her. "Yeah, I think so." "Better than the shop?" "Bigger than the shop, different. The shop's still the shop." She accepted this with a nod, the way she accepted most explanations that made internal sense, even if the details were beyond her. Then she picked up her orange juice and said, "Dakota's mom bought a new car. It has a screen in the headrest." "Nice." "We should get a car with a screen in the headrest." "We should get to school on time," Ryan said. The renovation took 4 months and 2 weeks, which was 3 weeks over the original estimate because the water infiltration in the northeast corner was worse than the structural assessment had suggested, and because the electrical rebuild uncovered a problem with the original conduit routing that required a redesign of one section of the power distribution layout. Ryan handled the redesign himself, in 2 evenings at the kitchen table, and sent the revised plans to the electrical contractor at 11:30 on a Thursday night. The contractor called him the next morning. "These are good plans," he said, with the tone of someone who hadn't expected them to be. "Thanks," Ryan said. "Can you get started on the reroute Monday?" "Tuesday at earliest." "Monday if you can," Ryan said. "I'll have coffee." He wasn't there for every hour of the construction. He couldn't be. But he was there enough that the foreman, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Carol Briggs, who had 30 years of industrial construction experience and a low tolerance for people who didn't know what they were talking about, stopped double-checking his decisions after the first week. "You know what you want," she told him one afternoon, looking at the drawings spread across the hood of his truck. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more accurate than that. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "People who've been thinking about it for a while usually want the wrong thing," Carol said. "You mostly want the right thing." "Mostly?" She pointed at a notation on the drawing. "This secondary conveyor routing, you've got a right-angle transfer here that's going to create a bottleneck when you're running at full capacity." Ryan looked at it. She was right. He'd known it was a marginal decision and had defaulted to the simpler build. She'd caught the longer-term problem. "How would you route it?" he asked. She took a pen and drew a line on the plans. It was a cleaner solution. It was also more expensive. "How much more, see?" he asked. She named a figure. Ryan did the math in his head. "Do it," he said. Carol looked at him for a moment. "Most clients argue." "You're right. I'm not going to pay more to be wrong." She made a sound that might have been approval, folded the plans, and went back to work. The permitting process moved at its own pace, which was the pace of a bureaucracy that had no particular incentive to hurry. Ryan attended 4 separate zoning hearings, testified before a county industrial review board, and spent an afternoon with a state environmental compliance inspector, who arrived with a list of 17 questions and left with answers to all of them, and apparently a respect for the quality of Ryan's drainage management plan. "This is thorough," the inspector said, flipping through the document. "I had a good engineer review it," Ryan said. The inspector looked up. "Which firm?" "Just me," Ryan said. The certification processes for aerospace-grade precision manufacturing were a different category of difficulty entirely. The standards were unforgiving in the way that standards are when the components being manufactured might eventually find their way into aircraft or defense systems where failure means something other than a warranty claim. Ryan had known this when he designed the systems. He had built the design around the certification requirements, not the other way around, which meant that when the first certification auditors came through, they found a facility that had been engineered specifically to pass their process, not because corners had been cut, but because Ryan had understood, from the beginning, exactly what the auditors were going to look for. The lead auditor, a former aerospace engineer named Dr. Rhonda Chung, who had been doing certification work for 11 years, walked the floor for 6 hours on her first visit. At the end, she sat across from Ryan in the facility's small conference room and looked at her notes for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "this facility isn't finished yet." "No, we open in 3 months. I'm going to be direct with you. In 11 years of doing this work, I have assessed 43 facilities attempting first-time certification for this class of manufacturing." She paused. 31 of them required significant remediation before I could recommend them for approval. 6 of them I recommended for denial on the first pass. Ryan waited. "This," she said, "is one of 6 facilities where I have not found a fundamental systems design error. The floor layout, the tolerance control architecture, the quality verification integration. Whoever designed this understood what they were designing." "Thank you," Ryan said. "I'm not done," she said. "The documentation is also exceptional, which is unusual. Usually the engineering is decent and the documentation is a disaster, or the documentation is fine and the engineering has problems." She looked at him directly. Who designed the systems? I did. She looked at him for a moment. What's your background? He told her briefly. Ohio State, the patents, the years in industrial engineering before he'd come back to Millhaven. She wrote something in her notes. I'll need 2 more site visits before I can issue a preliminary approval recommendation. But I want to be clear. I'm coming back to verify completion, not to look for problems. The problems I normally spend my time on aren't present here. Ryan nodded. We'll be ready. She stood, and they shook hands, and she paused at the door. Mr. Holloway, what made you come back to a town like Millhaven to do this? You could have done this anywhere. He thought about that for a moment. The people here needed it, he said, and the bones of the building were right. She seemed to consider this as an answer. Then she left. Patricia Owens, who had been standing just outside the conference room door and had heard the last part of the exchange, looked at Ryan when he came out. The bones of the building were right, she repeated. It's true, Ryan said. You could have also said, because I wanted to, Patricia said. That's also true, he admitted. She made the sound she made when she'd made a point and didn't need to belabor it, and went back to the floor where she was in the middle of setting up the quality control documentation system she'd been rebuilding from the ground up. Patricia Owens was, Ryan had confirmed within the first 2 weeks of her working there, exactly as good as he'd believed she would be. She'd come to that first meeting at Ronnie's Diner on Marsh Street in a careful blazer, and with the particular posture of someone who has been interviewed for jobs that went to other people and has learned not to get ahead of themselves. She had listened to Ryan's pitch, the facility, the market, the quality standards, the role, with her hands folded on the table and her expression professionally neutral. At the end, she had asked 4 questions. They were excellent questions, the kind that came from someone who had spent years thinking about the right way to do something and had had to watch the wrong way get done instead. Ryan answered them honestly, including the answer to her 3rd question, which was about what happened if the quality standards conflicted with a production deadline. The quality standards don't move, he said. The deadline does, every time. She had looked at him for a long moment, and he'd been able to see her deciding whether to believe him. I've heard that before, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm asking you to come build the system with me, and you'll see what I do when the first deadline conflict happens. And if you fold on it, then you leave, and you'll be right to, Ryan said. But I won't. She'd looked down at her coffee cup, then she'd looked back up. I want the same salary you quoted Dale. Dale had called her, apparently. Done, Ryan said. And I want to design the QC documentation architecture myself. No templates handed down from corporate, no pre-built systems I have to adapt. That's what I'm hiring you for, Ryan said. She'd picked up her coffee cup. Okay, she said, I'll give notice Wednesday. Now, 4 months later, Patricia was the person Ryan trusted most on the floor. She had a way of identifying quality system vulnerabilities that was almost adversarial. She approached every process as if she was trying to find a way to break it, which was exactly the right way to build something that wasn't going to break. She and Jimmy Park had developed an efficient and occasionally combative working relationship that Ryan found, from a distance, genuinely productive. Jimmy was better with the immediate diagnostic problem. Patricia was better at building the system that prevented the problem from recurring. They argued about process with the comfortable intensity of people who disagreed professionally and respected each other personally. They're fine, Dale Hutchins told Ryan one afternoon, nodding in the direction of Patricia and Jimmy, who were visibly disagreeing about something near the primary machining line. That's what good people working together looks like. You don't want everyone agreeing? I know, Ryan said. At the old plant, toward the end, everyone agreed about everything, Dale said. That's how you knew it was dying. Ryan thought about that. The facility, which he had registered as Holloway Precision Manufacturing, HPM internally, though the formal signage wouldn't go up until closer to the official opening, was scheduled to begin production in the 2nd week of January. It was now mid-November. The equipment was installed. The certification process was on track. The workforce was trained on the systems and had done 2 weeks of pilot runs on non-critical components to calibrate the line. The pilot run results had been better than Ryan's projections. This was not reassuring in the way people expected it to be. It made him look harder for the thing he'd missed, because things that are better than projected are either genuinely good or evidence that your baseline was wrong. He found one thing, the secondary conveyor routing, Carol Briggs' correction, the one that had cost extra, was performing slightly below optimal throughput because of a vibration harmonic at high speed that was affecting transfer timing. It was a small issue. It would have been easy to ignore. Ryan shut the conveyor down for 2 days, identified the harmonic source, installed a damping modification he designed over one evening, and ran the pilot again. It ran clean. Martin Lau came down from Columbus in November for a site review. He walked the floor with Ryan for 2 hours, asking the kind of questions that investment partners ask when they're deciding whether their confidence was well placed. Ryan answered all of them, and several of them by pointing at the thing rather than explaining it. Toward the end of the walk, Martin stopped in the middle of the floor and looked around at the overhead cranes, the machining lines, the quality station where Patricia was running a verification sequence, the organized movement of people who understood what they were doing and why. "Ryan," Martin said. "Yeah. This is something." "It's not done yet," Ryan said. "I know, but it's something." Martin paused. "The people you hired, that quality supervisor, the hydraulics guy, the old machinist who keeps calling everyone chief, they believe in this. They should. They built it." Martin looked at him. "You built it. They built it with you. That's different from how most people in your position would have done this." Ryan didn't have a ready answer to that. He wasn't sure it deserved one. He thought about the list of names on 3 handwritten pages. Patricia at Bricker's checkout, Jimmy at the car wash, Dale at the lumberyard. George Tillis, who'd driven back from Akron and showed up on his first day 20 minutes early with a thermos of coffee and had not been late once since. He thought about what Dale had said. Toward the end, everyone agreed about everything. He'd built it with people who knew how to disagree about the right things, and he'd built it on bones that were right, and he'd tried to build it in a way that wouldn't require anyone to fold when it mattered. Whether he'd succeeded, he wouldn't know until it was tested. "Come on," he said to Martin. "Patricia will show you the QC architecture. You'll want to see it before you have to describe it to your partners." Martin followed him toward the quality station, and the floor continued its work around them, machinery and people, and the particular quality of concentration that Ryan had only seen in places where the work was genuinely hard, and the people doing it knew it. Outside in the parking lot that had once been weeds and cracked asphalt, someone had planted a small Japanese maple near the entrance. Patricia's doing, apparently, without discussion, which was very much her way of operating. It was small and young and had no business being there yet by any conventional assessment. It had turned red in the November cold, the way those trees do. Ryan had noticed it when he'd arrived that morning and hadn't said anything about it because some things didn't require comment. He had an opening in 60 days, a contract negotiation with a regional aerospace supplier scheduled for the following week, and a 7-year-old who had informed him the previous evening that she intended to be an engineer when she grew up. Specifically, the kind that built things, not the kind that fixed things. "No offense, Daddy." "None taken," he'd said. She'd looked at him sideways. "Are you a little offended?" "Maybe a little." "That's fair," she'd said, and gone back to her robot book. He had work to do. Holloway Precision Manufacturing opened on a Thursday in the second week of January, with no ceremony and no press release. Ryan had considered both. Martin had suggested a soft launch event, nothing elaborate, just enough to put the name in front of the regional business community, maybe get a mention in the Ohio Manufacturing Association newsletter. Patricia had suggested, less diplomatically, that they spend the money on a second calibration instrument for the quality station instead. Ryan bought the calibration instrument and opened the doors on a Thursday. The first shift started at 6 in the morning. Ryan was there at 4:30, walking the floor alone with a flashlight and a legal pad that he didn't end up writing anything on, because everything was where it was supposed to be and had been checked twice the previous evening by people who were better at being nervous than he was. He was not precisely nervous. He was something more specific than that, a kind of heightened attention that came from knowing the difference between a thing that exists in plans and documentation and a thing that runs under real load for the first time. Plans are arguments. Running is proof. Dale arrived at 5:15 with his thermos, 21 years of plant experience, and the expression of a man who had been told he was getting something back that he'd stopped expecting to get back. He didn't say anything when he walked in. He stood just inside the main floor entrance and looked at the overhead cranes and the machining lines and the quality station and the organized grid of equipment that he and the rest of the crew had spent months installing, and he was quiet for long enough that Ryan walked over and stood next to him. "Dale?" "I'm fine," Dale said before Ryan could say anything else. "Don't make it a thing." "I wasn't going to," Ryan said. "Good." Dale screwed open his thermos. "You want coffee?" "Yeah," Ryan said. They stood there and drank bad thermos coffee in the pre-shift quiet of a manufacturing floor that was about to run for the first time, and neither of them made it a thing. By 6, everyone was in. Jimmy ran the startup sequence on the primary hydraulic systems with the focused calm of someone who had done this in his head approximately 300 times and was now finding out if the real version matched. Patricia was at the quality station with a clipboard, not because she needed the clipboard, but because, as she had once explained to Ryan, a clipboard gave her hand something to do that wasn't fidgeting. The line started at 6:14, 2 minutes behind the target startup time, because a coolant line connection on the secondary machining head needed a half-turn that Jimmy caught in the pre-run check. Ryan stood back. He had made the decision, early in the construction process, that his job on the floor was not to be the person who ran the line. His job was to have built the thing correctly. The people he'd hired were the ones who knew how to run it, and his standing over their shoulders was not going to improve what they already knew how to do. This was harder in practice than it was as a principal. He watched the first components come off the line at 6:40. Patricia pulled them immediately, ran them through the verification sequence, and documented the measurements. She did not look up at Ryan during this process. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked up. "Within spec," she said, not triumphant, just factual, the way Patricia delivered most things. But there was something in her face when she said it, a tightness around the eyes that loosened, so briefly he might have imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. "Again," Ryan said. They ran the line all day. By the end of the first shift, the measurement data was clean across 14 component runs. Not perfect. There were 2 instances where Patricia flagged a tolerance that was at the acceptable edge of spec and had Jimmy adjust the tooling, which he did, and which brought the measurements back to center. This was the system working the way it was supposed to work. This was the point. Ryan drove home at 7 in the evening, picked up a pizza because he had promised Emma pizza on what she had been calling the factory opening day for 2 months, and sat at the kitchen table while she ate 2 slices and told him about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar that had gone way more explodey than expected and required her teacher to open a window. "Way more explodey is usually better," Ryan said. Miss Kowalczyk didn't think so. Emma considered this. But she was smiling when she opened the window, so I think she thought it was a little bit better. Ryan ate his pizza and let the ordinary noise of the evening settle over him. Her voice, the sound of the refrigerator, a car going past outside, and tried to be fully present in it, rather than running through the day's data in his head. He mostly succeeded. He was in bed by 10. He lay awake for 40 minutes thinking about the edge spec measurement on component run 7, which he was going to talk to Jimmy about in the morning, and then he fell asleep and didn't dream about anything he could remember. The first contract came in the 3rd week of January. It was not a large contract. A regional supplier to the aerospace industry, a company called Meridian Components, based in Dayton, needed a precision subassembly fabricated to tolerances that most Ohio manufacturers weren't equipped to meet. They'd been sourcing from a facility in Pennsylvania that had experienced capacity problems, and they were looking for a closer alternative. The contact came through an industry directory listing that Martin's firm had arranged, and the initial conversation was with Meridian's procurement director, a straightforward man named Carl Briggs, no relation to Carol, who opened the conversation by saying, "I want to be direct with you. We have had 3 vendors fail our incoming inspection in the past 8 months. I don't have patience for another one." "That's a reasonable position," Ryan said. "Tell me about your quality systems," Ryan told him. Specifically, in technical detail, for 22 minutes. Carl Briggs asked 6 questions, all of them good ones. Ryan answered them without hedging. "Can I come see the facility?" Briggs asked. "When do you want to come?" "Monday." "Monday works," Ryan said. "Come at 6 in the morning if you want to see us run." Briggs came at 6 on Monday, walked the floor for 3 hours with Patricia as his guide, Ryan had made the deliberate decision to let Patricia run the facility tour because Patricia knew the quality systems better than he did, and because procurement directors who came to kick the tires on quality were better served talking to the person who actually built the system, and left at 9:30 with a request for a formal quote. The quote went in Tuesday. The contract was signed Thursday. It was not a large contract as these things go. It was proof of concept, which was exactly what it needed to be. The second contract, which came in February, was larger. A direct aerospace manufacturer this time, Halcyon Aerospace Systems, a mid-tier player in defense component supply, that had found HPM through a brief mention in an industry supplier bulletin. The contact from Halcyon was different in character from Carl Briggs. His name was David Park, no relation to Jimmy, and he was the kind of procurement professional who had been in the industry long enough to have a list of conversational landmines that he deployed as tests. "You're a new facility," he said in the first phone call. "No production history. What gives me confidence in your consistency?" "Nothing yet," Ryan said. "We've been running for 6 weeks. I have 6 weeks of quality data. I can send it to you." 6 weeks of data doesn't establish consistency. No, it establishes a baseline. You're right that we can't prove consistency yet. What I can tell you is that the systems are built to maintain consistency, even when individual variables shift, and I can walk you through the architecture of how and why. A pause. "You want to walk me through your system's architecture?" "If that's what it takes to have a real conversation, yes." Another pause. "Most vendors at your stage send a brochure." "I don't have a brochure," Ryan said. This turned out to be, for reasons Ryan didn't entirely understand, the right answer. Halcyon sent 2 engineers for a site visit the following week. The engineers, both with advanced degrees, both with the particular skepticism of people who had seen facilities oversell their capabilities, arrived with a list of 14 technical questions that were designed to distinguish a manufacturer who understood their own systems from one who had inherited systems they didn't fully understand. Ryan answered 12 of the 14 himself and brought Jimmy in for the hydraulic specifications on the remaining 2. One of the engineers, a woman named Dr. Frances Kim, looked at Ryan after the tour and asked, "Who designed the tolerance control architecture?" "I did," Ryan said. It was becoming a familiar answer. The integration between the measurement feedback and the real-time tooling adjustment, that's not a standard configuration. No, I designed it for this facility's production profile. Standard configurations have a response lag that creates tolerance drift at the volumes we're running. She looked at him in a way that Ryan recognized as a smart person recalibrating. "Can I see the design documentation?" He showed her. She spent 40 minutes with it. When she came out of the conference room, she said quietly to Ryan, "This is genuinely good work." "Thank you. I'm going to recommend we proceed," she said. It wasn't a guarantee. She was an engineer, not a procurement director. But Ryan knew what it meant. The Halcyon contract, when it came in 3 weeks later, was substantial enough that Ryan showed it to Martin before he signed it. Not because he needed permission, but because he needed someone to tell him he was reading the numbers correctly. "You're reading them correctly," Martin said over the phone. "Sign it." Ryan signed it. March brought 2 more contracts. April brought 3. And a phone call from an industry trade publication that wanted to write a brief profile on the new Ohio precision manufacturer that was showing up in aerospace supplier networks with unusual consistency ratings. Ryan turned down the profile. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and he had a policy, which he had not articulated as a policy, but which governed his behavior consistently, of not talking publicly about things he hadn't yet finished proving. Patricia thought he was wrong about the profile. "Visibility is not the enemy," she told him, in the direct way that had become one of the defining qualities of their working relationship. "I know, but right now every new contract is a test we pass or don't pass. I'd rather pass 20 tests before someone's writing about us." "How many is 20? "More than 8. She made the sound. "That's not a number. That's a feeling. It's an informed feeling." "Uh-huh." She went back to her documentation. They were having this conversation in early April when Ryan's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize with a Columbus area code. "Holloway Precision Manufacturing," he said. "Is this Ryan Holloway?" A woman's voice. Professional, measured, with an undertone of something careful that Ryan couldn't immediately identify. Speaking. My name is Claire Nakamura. I'm the executive assistant to Isabella Sterling at Sterling Industrial Group. I'm reaching out on Ms. Sterling's behalf. A brief pause. Ms. Sterling has become aware that Holloway Precision Manufacturing has been established in Mill Haven, and she would like, I'm reading this directly from her note, she would like to understand the situation. She's asked me to inquire about a meeting. Ryan stood very still. Of everything he had anticipated about the way the next stage of this would unfold, this specific call, this soon, had not been in the calculation. Can I ask what prompted this? He said. I'd rather Ms. Sterling explain that directly, Claire Nakamura said. There was something in her voice, not quite apology, but an awareness that the call was not entirely comfortable. I can say that it came to her attention through our supplier network intelligence. Several of our client relationships have... Another pause. There have been some changes in sourcing. Ms. Sterling asked us to investigate, and the investigation identified your company. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked across the floor where Jimmy was running a calibration check on the secondary machining head, and Dale was reviewing a maintenance log, and Patricia was at the quality station doing what Patricia was always doing at the quality station. Tell Ms. Sterling I'll be in touch, Ryan said. Of course. And Mr. Holloway, Claire Nakamura stopped, seemed to decide something. She understands if you're not interested in a meeting. I appreciate that, Ryan said. I'll be in touch. He hung up. Patricia had registered from across the floor that something had shifted. She didn't ask. She waited until he walked over to the quality station with the expression he wore when something was processing. Everything okay? She asked. Sterling Industrial just called, Ryan said. Patricia set her clipboard down. That was notable. Patricia very rarely set her clipboard down. Isabella Sterling? Her assistant. They want a meeting. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Ryan. She said it in the tone she used when she was about to say something she'd thought through more than once. You don't owe them a meeting. No, he agreed. But he looked at the floor, at the running line, at the people who had left grocery store jobs and car washes and lumber yards to be here, at the Japanese maple through the window that had survived the winter and was putting out cautious new leaves in the April light. I haven't decided if there's a but, he said. He left early that afternoon, something he rarely did. He told Patricia he'd be on his phone if anything came up, and he drove not back to Decker Avenue but east, to the far end of Commerce Boulevard, past the Sterling Industrial Plant with its brushed metal logo 4 feet tall above the entrance. He didn't stop. He just drove past. He thought about what Claire Nakamura had said. Several of our client relationships have had changes in sourcing. Careful language. The kind of language that meant something more direct underneath it. He already knew what it meant, roughly. He'd known it was coming in the way that you know any logical consequence of decisions you've been making for 14 months. 3 of HPM's contracts were with companies that had previously sourced from Sterling Industrial or its subsidiaries. He hadn't pursued those relationships because of that connection. He'd pursued them because they had quality requirements that matched what HPM was built to deliver. The sourcing shifts had been the client's decisions, made on the basis of his facility's performance, but he understood how it would look from Sterling's position. He drove for a while longer, nowhere specific, the kind of driving that is actually thinking in a vehicle. He ended up at the east side of town, near nothing particular, pulled over on a street of modest houses where a few kids were playing on a driveway in the late afternoon sun. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma's school. Reminder, science fair presentations tomorrow at 2 p.m. Parents welcome. He'd forgotten about the science fair presentation. He texted back, I'll be there. He sat there for a few more minutes. A kid on the driveway fell off a bicycle and immediately got back up and tried again, with the particular furious determination of children who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by falling down. Ryan watched that for a moment, then he called Martin. Sterling Industrial called, Ryan said when Martin picked up. The pause on the other end was precisely 3 seconds. Isabella Sterling called you personally? Her assistant. They want a meeting. Apparently they've noticed the client movement. Well? Martin was quiet for a moment. That was faster than I expected. Me too. What's your instinct? Ryan looked at the kid getting back on the bicycle. I don't know yet. That's why I'm calling you. Here's what I know, Martin said. Sterling has been having a rough quarter. The client movement you're aware of is part of it, but it's not the whole picture. There are some internal issues, Van. I'm hearing things from the Columbus business community that suggest they've got operational problems that go deeper than losing a few contracts to you. If they're reaching out now, it's because they need information, and information is only the first thing they need. You think they want more than a meeting? I think Isabella Sterling didn't become what she is by calling competitors just to have conversations, Martin said. She's calling you because she's trying to figure out how bad her situation is, and whether you're part of the problem or potentially part of the solution. Ryan was quiet. The question, Martin continued, is which one you want to be. I'm not trying to be either, Ryan said. I'm trying to run a manufacturing company. Those things can coexist. Look, don't answer them yet. Let me make a few calls and get a clearer picture of what's going on inside Sterling right now. Give me a week. Okay, Ryan said. And Ryan, whatever happened between you and Sterling before, the repair call, the ignored report, whatever it is, try not to let that be the thing that drives the decision. Ryan was quiet for a moment. How do you know about the report? You mentioned it years ago. I wasn't sure you remembered telling me. I remember. I know, just try not to let it drive the bus. A pause. You built something real. Real things attract attention. That's not a threat. It's just what happens next. Ryan said goodbye and sat in his truck on the quiet street while the afternoon went slowly to evening and the kids disappeared inside one by one until the driveway was empty. He thought about Isabella Sterling's face in the Sterling Industrial Facility. That quick, unguarded expression. The assessment she had made in 2 seconds and the way she'd moved on from it without looking back. He didn't feel triumphant about where things stood. He wanted to examine whether he felt triumphant, because triumph was the easy thing to feel. And it was usually a sign that you were looking at something personal rather than something practical. What he actually felt was tired and careful, and aware that the decisions ahead were going to matter in ways that the decisions behind him had also mattered, but in a different direction. He had built the thing to prove it could be built. That part was largely done. What came next was something else. He drove back to Decker Avenue, opened the shop, and worked on a compressor repair until 8 o'clock, because Trevor had flagged it as urgent, and Ryan didn't believe in letting urgent things wait. The work was familiar and physical, and required the specific, quiet attention that had always been the thing that settled him when other things were unsettled. He thought about calling Martin's contacts. He thought about Sterling Industrial's operational problems, whatever they were. He thought about the meeting request, and about the report he'd written 4 years ago, and about the moment he'd stood in the empty East facility alone with a flashlight and a legal pad, and believed he could make something out of it. He thought about Patricia's Japanese maple putting out its new leaves. He finished the compressor. He locked the shop. He drove home, checked on Emma, asleep, sprawled diagonally across her bed in the way that made the bed seem both too small and completely adequate, and stood in the kitchen with a glass of water in the quiet of 11 o'clock. He had a science fair presentation to attend tomorrow at 2. He had a decision to make about a meeting request from a company that had laughed at him and buried a report and sold him an abandoned building without knowing who they were selling it to. He had a manufacturing floor running at a quality level that was beginning to move things in the market. He had Emma's robot book on the kitchen counter, open to a page about a robot that had built something larger than itself and didn't quite know what to do with the fact of it. He closed the book. He washed the glass and put it away and went to bed. 4 days later, he got a call from David Park at Halcyon Aerospace. Park's voice had a different register than their previous conversations, tighter, more direct, the voice of someone delivering news rather than making an inquiry. I wanted to give you a heads up before this gets into broader circulation, Park said. We're expanding the HPM contract. The quality data from the first 3 months came back to our engineering review yesterday, and we're moving to make you a preferred supplier for 2 additional component categories. Ryan set down the pen he'd been holding. What categories? Park named them. They were not small categories. The expanded contract would more than double HPM's current Halcyon volume and would require, Ryan calculated almost immediately, a second shift and a tooling investment that was significant but within the capital plan Martin and he had built for year 2. We're also, Park added, recommending you to two colleagues of mine at peer firms. I don't normally do that. I'm telling you because you should know it's coming and because I want you to understand why your incoming inspection pass rate over 13 weeks is the highest we've seen from a facility in your production stage. Not slightly higher, considerably higher. I'll pass that to my quality supervisor, Ryan said. You should. It's her number. A pause. Can I ask you something? Sure. The tolerance control system, Dr. Kim mentioned it to me. She said it's an unusual design. It is. Did you patent it? Yes, Ryan said. 2 years ago. A brief silence. I see. Well, congratulations, Mr. Holloway. We look forward to the expanded relationship. Ryan hung up. He was standing in the middle of the HPM floor when he took that call. Around him the line was running. The overhead cranes moved with the particular deliberate precision of well-maintained industrial equipment. Jimmy was at the hydraulics station. Dale was at the machining line. Patricia was doing what Patricia always did. Nobody had heard the phone call. Nothing on the floor had changed. Ryan stood there for a moment, in the noise and the motion of the thing he'd built, and felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but something more complicated than either. The particular feeling of having been right about something that had cost a great deal to be right about. He put his phone in his pocket and went to find Patricia. She was annotating a measurement log when he walked up. She looked at him and registered his expression. What happened? She said. Halcyon is expanding the contract, preferred supplier status for 2 additional categories. He paused. Park is also referring us to 2 peer firms. Patricia looked at him. Then she set down her clipboard, which she only did on significant occasions, and she said, Okay. The QC consistency rating is what drove it. Park specifically mentioned it. Something moved across Patricia's face. The same kind of brief, tightly controlled thing that Ryan had seen on the day the line first ran clean. Not performance. The opposite of performance. Okay, she said, again, more quietly. I wanted you to know first, Ryan said. She picked up her clipboard. Well, we're going to need a second shift. I know. And new tooling for the Category 7 setup. I know. I'm calling Martin today. And we need to hire. I'm not compromising the training timeline to get warm bodies on the line faster. You won't have to, Ryan said. We'll do it the same way we did the first time. She nodded. Then she said, without looking up from the log, You were right about the bones of the building. Ryan looked at her. What? That's what you told the certification auditor, that the bones were right. She made a notation. You were right. He didn't have a good answer to that. He walked back across the floor, past Dale, who nodded at him without pausing his work, past Jimmy, who was telling George Tillis something about a pressure calibration and using his hands the way he always did when he was explaining something hydraulic. The line ran. Outside, barely visible through the floor's side window, the Japanese maple caught the afternoon light and held it for a moment. Something small and living, improbably there, doing exactly what it was built to do. Ryan picked up his phone and called Martin. Martin called back 8 days after the Halcyon expansion, which was 7 days after Ryan had told him about Sterling Industrial's meeting request, and 1 day after an industry trade publication ran a short item in its supplier intelligence section under the headline, Ohio newcomer HPM posts remarkable quality metrics. Aerospace clients take notice. Ryan had not authorized the item. David Park had apparently mentioned HPM by name in an industry roundtable, and someone at the publication had followed up. It was 4 paragraphs. It named the Halcyon relationship, cited the quality metrics in general terms, and described Holloway Precision Manufacturing as a Mill Haven, Ohio facility that has moved with unusual speed from construction to preferred supplier status in the aerospace component segment. It did not name Ryan personally. Patricia read it and said, 4 paragraphs. You got off easy. Ryan read it and thought about Claire Nakamura's phone call and what it would look like to someone at Sterling Industrial's corporate office who was already looking. Martin called that evening. I've been talking to people, Martin said without preamble. The picture inside Sterling is not good. Ryan sat down. How not good? The client movement. Losing contracts to you and 2 other competitors over the past 8 months. That's the visible part. The part that's showing up in their quarterly numbers. But the internal situation is worse than the external one. Martin paused, and Ryan recognized the pause as the one Martin used when he was assembling the right order for information. 3 of their senior operations people have been running a short-term margin strategy for about 2 years, cutting corners on maintenance cycles, deferring capital investments, pushing production volumes past optimal capacity to hit quarterly targets. Who sanctioned that? That's the question Isabella is apparently asking right now, Martin said. The answer is complicated. Some of it was sanctioned, some of it was buried in operational reporting that didn't surface accurately to the executive level. Sterling's board called for an internal audit 6 weeks ago. It's still in progress. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Does she know the extent of it? She's finding out. That's what makes the timing of her outreach to you interesting. Martin paused again. Here's my read, and tell me if I'm wrong. Sterling has an operational credibility problem. They're losing clients to a facility that, and they're just now figuring this out, was built by the engineer they dismissed 3 years ago on property they let sit derelict and sold without due diligence on the buyer. From Isabella's perspective, she's got an internal mess and an external story that is going to become very uncomfortable when it gets into broader circulation. She's not calling me to have a conversation, Ryan said. No, she's calling you because she needs to understand the scope of her situation, and you're the one person who can tell her something accurate about it because you built the thing she's measuring herself against. Martin stopped. But there's something else. What? I talked to someone who was in a board meeting at Sterling 2 months ago. Off the record, not attributable to anyone. A brief pause. Isabella Sterling has been running this company for 11 years. She took it over from her father at 29, rebuilt the management structure, doubled revenue in the first 4 years. She is not by most accounts the kind of leader who buries problems or punishes people for delivering bad news. But she trusted people she shouldn't have, and she didn't look closely enough at the operational reporting, and some of those people took advantage of that trust in ways that are going to cost her significantly. Martin let that land. She's not the villain of her own story, Ryan. She's the person who made mistakes and is currently sitting inside the consequences of them. Ryan thought about the woman in the charcoal blazer walking through the manufacturing floor. The practiced efficiency. The way she moved through a room like someone who was comfortable in difficult situations. He thought about the 2 seconds in which she had looked at his truck and made a face she didn't know he'd seen. I know she's not the villain, Ryan said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because I want to make sure it's the version of events you're operating from when you decide what to do. Martin. Yeah. Set up the meeting. A pause. You sure? Yes? On your terms or hers? Ryan thought about it. My terms, my facility. I'm not driving to Columbus for this. Martin was quiet for a moment. That's a statement. It's a location, Ryan said. My schedule is here. My work is here. If she wants to understand the situation, she can come see it. All right, Martin said. I'll reach out to her office. He paused one more time. How are you feeling about this? It was a real question, which was one of the things about Martin that Ryan had always valued. Not a procedural question, not a strategic question. A real one. I don't know yet, Ryan said honestly. Ask me after the meeting. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 3 weeks out. The 3 weeks were not uneventful. The HPM second shift came online in the second week of May, staffed with 8 new employees that Patricia had taken through a 2-week training process that she described as rigorous and that Dale described privately to Ryan as the kind of thing that either breaks people or makes them excellent, and the ones who make it are the ones you want. All 8 made it. One of them, a young woman named Keisha Morris, who had previously been working in a distribution center, showed such an immediate aptitude for quality inspection that Patricia pulled her to the QC station after 4 days and began training her directly. She sees things, Patricia told Ryan, with the particular brevity she used for significant statements. Good, Ryan said. I'm putting her on the Halcyon Category 7 verification. I want a second set of eyes on that line. Done. The tooling investment for the expanded Halcyon categories came in under budget by 11%, primarily because Jimmy had found a supplier for the precision tooling components who offered a volume discount that Ryan hadn't known to negotiate for, because Jimmy had grown up in a manufacturing family and had an instinctive understanding of supplier relationships that no engineering degree teaches. How did you know to call them? Ryan asked, looking at the invoice. Jimmy shrugged. My uncle used them when he was running the shop in Canton. Good people. He paused. Also, I called 6 other suppliers first and compared. That's good work, Jimmy. I'm just doing my job. Your job doesn't technically include tooling procurement. Jimmy looked at the invoice. Nobody told me that. Ryan let it go. There was a category of employee who did exactly what their job description said and not 1 inch more. And they were fine. They were useful. They were part of a functional operation. And then there was the other kind. Ryan had somehow managed to hire mostly the other kind, which he suspected had something to do with the fact that he'd hired people who had been doing grocery store checkouts and car wash shifts for 2 years and remembered what it felt like to do work that matched their actual capacity. People who've been underestimated tend to have strong feelings about doing the work right. Ryan had noticed this and filed it away as something true. The 3 weeks passed with the particular quality of time that is very full and moves both slowly and quickly. Emma's school year was ending, which meant a cascade of end-of-year events, a field trip permission slip he nearly forgot to sign, a class party for which he was assigned to bring something festive but nut-free, and a final parent-teacher conference with Ms. Kowalczyk, who told him that Emma was, quote, intellectually voracious, occasionally too confident in her own conclusions, and a delight to have in class, though she did once argue with me for 10 minutes about whether the story problem's math was wrong. Was it? Ryan asked. Miss Kowalczyk paused. Yes, actually, the story problem did have a math error, but she still needed to work through the intended process. Did you tell her that? I told her that being right and being useful are sometimes different skills. Ryan thought about that on the drive home. He told Emma about it over dinner in slightly different terms, and she listened seriously and then said, but the math was still wrong. Yes. So I was right. You were right about the math, but the argument was less important than the work. She thought about this with the focused consideration she gave things she wasn't entirely ready to accept. That seems like it depends, she said finally. Ryan looked at her. 7 years old and her mother's directness, her father's refusal to let a flawed argument stand. He wasn't sure whether to be proud or slightly concerned about the next decade. Yeah, he said, it does depend. The morning of the Thursday meeting arrived gray and cool for May, with a low sky that sat over Millhaven like a slightly damp ceiling. Ryan had been at the facility since 5. He was not nervous in the way he'd been nervous on the facility's opening day. That had been the anxiety of a first run, of proof meeting plan. This was different. This was a meeting he'd had versions of in his head for 4 years. In the unfocused way you have imaginary conversations with people who have wronged you without intending to. And the gap between the imaginary version and the real version was going to be significant in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. He'd told Patricia about the meeting the previous week. He'd told her who was coming and why. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, do you want me to be on the floor or in the office? Floor, Ryan said, doing exactly what you'd be doing on any other Thursday. Okay. A pause. Do you want Dale and Jimmy to know? Ryan thought about it. Tell them there's a visitor from a corporate account. Don't tell them who. Patricia had looked at him. You're not ashamed of it? No. Then why? Because I don't want anyone performing, Ryan said. I want her to see what we actually are, not what we look like when we know we're being observed. Patricia had nodded once, the nod she gave when she understood something and agreed with the reasoning even if she might have approached it differently. Now, at 9:05 on the Thursday morning, a black car pulled into the HPM parking lot. Ryan was in the small conference room when Claire Nakamura, he recognized her voice from the phone call, knocked and opened the door. She was a composed, precise woman in her mid-30s who conveyed professionalism the way some people convey warmth, as a natural default rather than a performance. Mr. Holloway, Miss Sterling is ready when you are. Bring her in, Ryan said. He stood. Isabella Sterling walked into the conference room of Holloway Precision Manufacturing at 9:07 on a Thursday morning, and Ryan watched her cross the threshold and take in the room, its modest dimensions, the folding table that served as a conference table, the 2 chairs with their mismatched origin stories, the window that looked out onto the manufacturing floor, with an expression that was very carefully composed and not quite successfully neutral. She was dressed in a dark blazer over a simple blouse, less formal than what she'd been wearing at the Sterling plant, and Ryan registered that she had made some kind of deliberate choice about that. Her dark hair was down. She looked, and he examined this observation carefully before letting himself keep it, tired. Not visibly, not in a way that announced itself. In the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a while and has gotten good at not showing it. She extended her hand. "Mr. Holloway? Ms. Sterling." They shook hands. Her grip was firm without being declarative about it. They sat down on opposite sides of the folding table. Claire Nakamura closed the conference room door from the outside, leaving them alone. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time in a small room between two people who have a history that only one of them fully understands. Isabella spoke first. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here. I know this was on your terms, and I want you to know that I'm aware of what that means." Ryan looked at her. "What does it mean to you?" She met his gaze directly. "That you have no reason to make this easy for me, and that you're choosing to have this conversation anyway." A brief pause. "I want to be honest with you about why I'm here. Please." She folded her hands on the table, a gesture that reminded him briefly of Patricia at Ronnie's diner on Marsh Street. The gesture of someone who has prepared for a difficult thing and is now doing it. 6 weeks ago, our internal audit began surfacing operational irregularities that go back approximately 2 years. The scope of it is significant. Several of my senior people made decisions that I didn't sanction and didn't know about until recently, and those decisions contributed to a deterioration in our quality consistency and our client relationships. She paused. In the course of investigating the client movement we'd been tracking, my team identified your company. And when they identified your company, they identified you. "And?" Ryan said. "And I authorized a full background review of Holloway Precision Manufacturing and its ownership." She looked at him steadily. "I found the report." The room was quiet. Through the conference room window, the floor was running, the sound of it muffled but present. That particular industrial hum that Ryan had come to find as natural as background weather. "Which report?" Ryan said, though he knew. "The 47-page engineering assessment of this facility, submitted to our corporate development office 4 years ago." She paused. "With your name on it." Ryan said nothing. "I also found the response we sent you," Isabella said. "The 1-paragraph email." She said this the way you say something you've said to yourself many times already, trying different inflections to understand what it cost. "I want you to know that I did not see that report at the time it was submitted. I have since reviewed the routing records, and it was received by a coordinator in corporate development who filed it as an unsolicited submission and did not escalate it." "I know," Ryan said. She looked at him. "You know?" "I figured it out eventually, not immediately. For about a year I assumed it had been reviewed and rejected. But the response email had the language of a form reply, not a substantive review. And a few things I learned later about your corporate development process at the time suggested the submission protocols weren't well managed." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't make it less of a failure on our part." "No," Ryan agreed. "It doesn't." She looked down at the table, then back up. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "When you purchased this facility, when you bought it from Sterling Industrial, did you know you were buying it from us? Did you know who the seller was?" "Yes," Ryan said. "And you did it anyway." "Yes." She absorbed this. "Why?" Ryan looked at her for a moment. "Because the report was right. The facility was what I said it was. The opportunity was what I said it was." He paused. "The fact that you were the seller didn't change any of that." "It didn't give you any—" She stopped, chose a different word. "Satisfaction? To buy something from us that we'd let deteriorate and turn it into this?" "I thought about that," Ryan said honestly. "When I was deciding, I looked for it, whether that was part of the reason. I didn't find it. I found that the math worked and the bones of the building were right, and I had people who deserved better work than they were doing." He gestured toward the window. "You can see the floor from here. Those people worked at grocery stores and car washes and lumber yards. They had skills this market needs and nobody was using them. That was the reason. Isabella turned and looked through the window at the floor. Dale was at the machining line, moving with the particular deliberate competence of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. Jimmy was talking to Keisha at the quality station. Patricia was making a notation on something and then looking up to check the line with the focused, scanning attention she gave it a dozen times an hour. Isabella watched them for a moment. "Tell me about your quality systems director," she said, the woman at the station. "Patricia Owens, former quality control supervisor at the Millhaven East Transmission Plant when it was still running. She's been building industrial QC systems for 20 years. She was available?" "She was working checkout at Brickers on 3rd Street, Ryan said. Isabella looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not quite the expression from the Sterling facility parking lot, but in the same family. The expression of someone calculating the cost of a decision they didn't know they'd made. "How many of your workforce came from similar situations?" she asked. "Most of them." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We let those people go. When the East facility closed years ago, that was before my time running the company, but it was our decision, our plant." "I know." "And you hired them back." "I hired them because they're good," Ryan said. "Where they were before is context, not reason." Isabella looked at the floor again. Then she looked back at Ryan with the expression of someone making a decision about how honest to be. "I owe you an apology," she said. Ryan waited. "When I came to your repair shop last year," she held his gaze, "I made an assessment of you based on the sign, the building, the truck. I dismissed you before you'd said a word." A brief pause. "I didn't realize I'd done it at the time. I thought I was just processing a routine contractor call. I understand now that what I was doing was something less professional than that." Ryan looked at her. He had thought about this moment, in the abstract version of it that he'd run in his head occasionally over the past year. He had imagined various versions of what he would feel when it arrived. What he actually felt was something complicated and quieter than he'd expected. Not vindication, not satisfaction. Something more like the feeling of watching a long equation finally resolve. The answer was correct, but the emotional energy of being right had been largely spent in the proving of it, and what remained was just the answer. "Thank you for saying that," he said. It was not a gracious dismissal. It was what he actually meant. Isabella nodded. She seemed to have expected more, and then seemed to accept that what he'd said was the actual response, not a polite stand-in for a larger one. "I'd like to see the facility," she said, "if you're willing." Ryan stood. "I'll show you." He took her onto the floor. He did not run a stage tour. He walked her through the facility the way he'd walk anyone through it, starting at the primary machining line, explaining the tolerance control architecture in the specific technical terms that the architecture deserved, answering her questions directly. She asked good questions. He hadn't known whether to expect that and found himself recalibrating in real time away from the version of Isabella Sterling he'd been carrying and toward the version that was actually standing next to him. She understood manufacturing, not in a generalist, executive overview way, in the specific way of someone who had grown up in the industry, who had been in plants since she was a child, who had learned to read production lines the way other people learned to read rooms. When they reached the quality station, Ryan introduced her to Patricia. Patricia shook her hand without particular ceremony. "Miss Sterling." "Ms. Owens?" Isabella paused. "Your incoming inspection pass rate, it's been mentioned in the industry. What's your methodology for the tolerance verification on the Category 7 components?" Patricia looked at her for a fraction of a second, reassessing. Then she explained. She explained with the same completeness she gave any technical question, which was full completeness, because Patricia had no gear between thorough and silent. It took 6 minutes. Isabella listened without interrupting, which was apparently the right response, because when Patricia finished, she answered a follow-up question with a level of additional detail she usually reserved for people she'd decided were worth the time. They moved on. Ryan introduced her to Jimmy, who was professional and slightly wary. To Dale, who shook her hand and said, "Dale Hutchins, I ran machining at your East plant for 11 years, with the particular directness of a man who was going to name the fact and let it sit where it landed." Isabella absorbed it. "Mr. Hutchins, I know the facility you're describing. I'm glad to see you're still in the industry." "I'm glad to be in it," Dale said, and went back to his work. Ryan watched this exchange and said nothing. At the end of the floor walk, they stood at the loading dock end of the facility where the finished components were staged for quality verification and shipping. The bay doors were open and the May air, still gray but warming, came in from outside. Isabella stood and looked back at the length of the facility. The full floor, running, people moving with the specific, unhurried competence of people who knew their jobs. "You built this in 14 months, she said. It wasn't quite a question. 14 months from purchase to first production run, Ryan said. I've been in this industry my entire life, she said. I have never seen a facility go from derelict to aerospace certified in 14 months. The system's design was done before we bought the building, Ryan said. I'd been working on it for 3 years. By the time we broke ground, we weren't figuring out what to build. We were just building it. She was quiet for a moment. The report, she said. If we'd acted on it when you submitted it, it would have been different, Ryan said. We'd have built this. Instead of you. Maybe. Or something like it. He paused. The system's design wasn't in the report. The report was the facility assessment and the market case. The manufacturing architecture, the tolerance control systems, the QC integration, the things that are making the quality metrics look the way they do, that's 3 more years of thinking. You couldn't have built what I built from the report alone. She turned and looked at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, Ryan said. They're not always the same thing, but in this case they are. She looked at him for a moment longer, and he saw something in her expression. Not the quick assessment from the parking lot, nothing like that, but something more considered and more difficult, the look of someone doing real accounting. Mr. Holloway, she said, I need to be direct about something. Go ahead. Sterling Industrial is going through a significant restructuring. The audit results are going to require leadership changes, operational overhaul, and a strategic reassessment of several of our manufacturing positions. She paused. I'm also aware that the market segments where we've lost ground are segments you're now established in. The competitive dynamics here are going to be uncomfortable for the next several years, regardless of what decisions either of us makes. I know, Ryan said. What I want to know, and I'm asking this directly because I think you're someone who answers direct questions directly, is whether you have any interest in a commercial relationship with Sterling, not as a competitor, as a partner or supplier in areas where our current capabilities have gaps. Ryan looked at her. You're asking if I'd sell to you. I'm asking if there's a structure that serves both our interests, she said. I'm aware I have no leverage here. I'm aware that you don't need this. I'm asking because the honest answer to our operational problems involves accessing manufacturing quality that we currently can't match internally, and the honest answer to where that quality exists in this region is standing in front of me. It was, Ryan thought, a remarkably direct statement. He had expected corporate language, negotiating positioning, the kind of professional euphemism that large companies deploy as both armor and weapon. What she'd given him instead was something with less protection in it. He thought about what Martin had said. She trusted people she shouldn't have, and she's sitting inside the consequences. He thought about Dale saying, I'm glad to be in it. He thought about Patricia's Japanese maple in the parking lot, improbably surviving. I'm not interested in a supplier relationship, Ryan said. Isabella held his gaze. Okay. But I'm willing to hear what a partnership structure looks like, not today. I need to review your financial position, and my partner Martin Lau would need to be part of those conversations. And I'd want to understand the full scope of what your audit found before I consider any formal arrangement. She nodded. That's fair. I also want to be clear about one thing, Ryan said. Tell me. I'm not doing this to complete any story. I'm not interested in... He paused, finding the right words. Whatever the narrative is about the guy who got overlooked coming back to save the company that overlooked him, that's not what this would be. What would it be? Business. If the numbers work and the structure is fair and the people here are protected, I'll have the conversation. If any of those things aren't true, I won't. He looked at her directly. That's the only version available. Isabella Sterling looked at him for a long moment. In the background, the floor ran, the hum of it steady and continuous, the particular sound of a place that was doing what it was built to do. That's the version I came here to find out if it existed, she said. They shook hands again at the facility entrance. Claire Nakamura, appearing from somewhere efficient to hold the door. Isabella paused at the threshold. She looked back at the floor one more time, and Ryan watched her look at it. The equipment, the people, the organized motion of the thing, with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not admiration, not exactly. Something more complicated than that. The expression of someone who is looking at both what exists and what might have been, and knows the difference matters, and is trying to figure out what to do with knowing it. "One more question," she said. "Yeah. The sign on your repair shop on Decker Avenue, the faded one." She paused. "Are you keeping it?" Ryan considered that. "Probably not," he said. "I've been meaning to replace it for a while." She nodded once. Then she walked out to the black car, and Claire Nakamura closed the door behind her, and they drove out of the parking lot and onto Commerce Boulevard and away. Ryan stood in the facility entrance for a moment. Behind him, the floor ran. Through the side window, he could see the Japanese maple, its new May leaves a particular clear green in the gray morning light. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Can we have tacos tonight?" She was at school. She was not supposed to be texting from school. This was a conversation they'd had 3 times. He texted back, "Yes. Also, you're not supposed to text in school." The reply came 40 seconds later. "I know, sorry. Tacos Theo." Ryan put his phone in his pocket and went back inside. Patricia was at the quality station. She looked up when he came in. "How'd it go?" she asked. "She wants to have a conversation about a partnership structure." Patricia looked at him steadily. "And?" "And I told her I'd hear what it looks like." He paused. "After the audit results are fully in and Martin reviews the financials." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Is that the right call?" "I don't know yet," Ryan said honestly. "But it's the honest one." She considered this. Then she picked up her clipboard. "Okay, the Category 7 run starts in 20 minutes. You should be here for the first cycle." "I'll be here," Ryan said. He walked out onto the floor and took his place. Not at any particular station, not directing or supervising, just present in the way that the person who built a thing is present when it runs. The way you stand near something you made and let it be what it is. The line ran. Outside, somewhere on Decker Avenue, there was a sign that had been faded for years. Navy blue, gone to washed-out gray blue. A name barely readable in certain light. Ryan had been meaning to replace it. He thought, for the first time with any clarity, about what he wanted the new one to say. Martin flew in from Columbus on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Isabella's visit to the facility, with a leather portfolio that was thicker than usual, and the expression of someone who had been doing difficult math and had arrived at an answer he found both interesting and slightly uncomfortable. He spread the documents across the folding conference room table. Sterling Industrial's last 3 annual reports, the preliminary audit findings that Isabella's team had released to Ryan under a confidentiality agreement, and a 12-page financial analysis that Martin's firm had prepared independently. "Okay," Martin said, settling into the chair that squeaked. He'd stopped noticing the squeak. "Here's what we're looking at." Ryan sat across from him with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once, because Patricia had bought a real coffee maker for the break room the previous week and put a sign next to it that said, "This is not negotiable," in her particular handwriting, which was very small and very precise and somehow conveyed absolute authority. "Sterling's core operational business is still sound," Martin said. "The revenue base is real, the client relationships that remain are generally strong, and the manufacturing capacity on their primary lines is not the problem." He tapped the audit summary. "The problem is what the audit found, which is 2 years of decisions made by 3 senior operations leaders, all of whom have since resigned, that traded long-term facility health for short-term margin appearance. Deferred maintenance, inflated output projections, quality control shortcuts that didn't show up in the headline numbers for about 18 months, and then started showing up everywhere at once." "How deep does it go?" Ryan asked. "Deep enough that 2 of their aerospace clients have placed Sterling on probationary supplier status pending an independent quality audit. Deep enough that their Q2 numbers are going to be publicly uncomfortable." Martin paused. "But not so deep that the company is in existential trouble. This is a serious wound, not a fatal one. With the right restructuring and the right operational changes, Sterling comes back. It takes 2 to 3 years, and it's not painless. but the underlying business can support it. What does she want from us? Martin opened a different section of the portfolio. She's proposing a manufacturing partnership structured in 3 tiers. First tier, HPM becomes a preferred supplier for Sterling's aerospace component categories where their internal quality has been flagged. Those contracts come to us at defined volume commitments, giving us predictable load on the second shift. Second tier, Sterling licenses access to the tolerance control architecture for implementation in 2 of their own facilities, with HPM providing consulting support during the transition. He looked up. That's the interesting one. Ryan looked at the document. She wants the patent license. At a negotiated rate, not a buyout. She's not asking to own it. A licensed implementation with defined scope. Martin set the document down. The third tier is an equity conversation that I think is premature and told her office as much. She's interested in a minority stake in HPM. I've told them that's not on the table for this discussion. Why premature? Because you don't sell equity to someone whose internal situation you haven't finished evaluating, Martin said, with the tone of someone stating something obvious enough that explaining it felt mildly insulting. In a year, if tiers 1 and 2 work, maybe. Not now. Ryan looked at the audit summary. He'd read it twice the previous evening, after Emma was in bed, at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the quiet of the house. It was a thorough document. Isabella's internal team had not softened the findings, which told him something about how she'd instructed them to conduct the process. The 3 operations leaders who had resigned were named. Their specific decisions were documented. The financial impact of each category of decision was quantified. It was, in its way, a more honest document than Ryan had expected. Companies in crisis had an incentive to minimize and manage the narrative. This document had not done that. What's your read on the proposal overall? Ryan asked. Martin leaned back. The chair squeaked. Tiers 1 and 2 are genuinely good for us. The volume commitment from Tier 1 gets the second shift to full utilization, which we need anyway to justify the capital investment we're about to make for Year 2. The license fee from Tier 2 is significant revenue with essentially 0 incremental cost. The architecture is built. The documentation exists. The consulting support is Pat and Jimmy's time at a rate that more than compensates for the load. He paused. The numbers work, Ryan, both for us and for them. This isn't a rescue deal where we're giving more than we're getting. It's a genuinely bilateral arrangement. But, Ryan said, because there was one in Martin's tone. But you need to be clear about what you're signing up for strategically. If this works, if Sterling stabilizes and their quality recovers under our license arrangement, they become a stronger competitor in segments we're targeting. You're helping them come back. Ryan was quiet for a moment. I know. That doesn't bother you? Ryan thought about it honestly. A stronger industry is better for everyone in it. If the license arrangement genuinely improves their quality systems, the market benefits. Our competitive position comes from the architecture we've built and the people who run it, not from our competitors being weak. He paused. I don't want to win because Sterling is broken. I want to compete against a functioning industry. Martin looked at him for a long moment. You know, most people in your position would not say that. Most people in my position didn't sit on a 47-page report for 4 years while someone else did nothing with the same opportunity, Ryan said. I have a specific view of what happens when people compete by not building rather than by building better. Martin was quiet. Then he nodded. All right, I'll go back to our team with a counter-proposal on the Tier 2 license rate. Their opening number is low, and we'll negotiate the volume guarantees on Tier 1. I think we can get this closed in 3 to 4 weeks. One condition, Ryan said. Tell me. The consulting support for the license implementation. I want approval rights on which of Sterling's facilities we're working with and what the implementation timeline looks like. I'm not sending Patricia into a facility that isn't ready for what she's going to put in place, and I'm not compressing the timeline to meet someone's PR calendar. Martin made a note. Reasonable. I'll put it in the term sheet. Also, the volume commitment on Tier 1 needs a quality floor. If our components go into their line and something downstream fails because of a Sterling process issue, I want a contractual separation between their process and our component specifications. Already in my draft, Martin said, with mild satisfaction. That one I anticipated. Ryan looked at the documents on the table. Months of work, 4 years of thinking, a facility that had gone from weeds and rust to preferred aerospace supplier. And here was the next thing. A negotiation across a table with the company that had laughed at the sign on his shop and filed his report under future consideration and sold him an abandoned building without knowing who they were selling it to. He had looked, again, for the feeling of triumph, for something that tasted like vindication. He still didn't find it. What he found instead was something harder to name, a kind of completion that had nothing to do with anyone else's acknowledgement of it. The work had been the point. The work had always been the point. The rest of it was context, some of it painful and some of it absurd, but context nonetheless. "Close it," Ryan said. Martin closed the portfolio. "I'll have the counterproposal to her team by Thursday." They shook hands across the folding table, in the small conference room with the window that looked out onto the floor, and outside the floor ran the way it always ran now, steadily, with the sound of things being made correctly. The negotiation took 4 weeks, not 3. Martin had predicted the Tier 2 license rate would require adjustment, and it did. 3 rounds of back and forth before landing at a number that Ryan found genuinely fair and that Sterling's CFO, from what Martin reported, found genuinely painful. Ryan did not consider this a problem. A deal that didn't cost both sides something in the negotiation was usually a deal where one side hadn't paid attention. The Tier 1 volume commitments took longer to finalize because Sterling's procurement team, new people, brought in as part of the restructuring, without the institutional reluctance of the people who'd previously managed the relationship, wanted specific performance guarantees built into the contract language. Patricia reviewed the proposed quality specifications line by line and came back with 7 amendments, 6 of which Sterling accepted immediately, and 1 of which required a technical conversation between Patricia and Sterling's incoming quality director, a woman named Sandra Foley, who had been hired specifically to lead the post-audit operational recovery. Patricia and Sandra Foley spoke for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon. Ryan was present for the first 20 minutes, and then, on the basis that he was the least technically essential person in the room, excused himself and went to deal with the tooling question Jimmy had been sitting on. When he came back, Patricia and Sandra were still talking, but the quality of the conversation had shifted from negotiating to problem solving, which was a different gear entirely. "You know each other?" Ryan asked when Sandra had left. "We don't," Patricia said, "but she knows what she's doing." A pause. "The amendment language is fine. She understood the first time I explained it." From Patricia, this was essentially a character reference. The contracts were signed on a Friday afternoon in the second week of June in the HPM conference room, with Martin present and Sterling represented by their general counsel and Sandra Foley, who had apparently asked to be in the room for the quality specifications signing. Isabella was not present. Ryan had not expected her to be. This was an operational agreement, not a symbolic moment, and he respected that she understood the difference. He signed his name on the final page of the last document and slid it across the table, and that was that. Martin stayed after Sterling's team left. He sat in the squeaking chair and looked at Ryan across the folding table. "How do you feel?" he asked. Ryan thought about it. "Like there's a lot of work to do." Martin laughed, a real one, the kind that came from genuine surprise. "That's it? We just closed a deal that 3 years ago would have been..." "Ryan, you understand what just happened here." "I understand what just happened," Ryan said. "I also understand that Patricia is going to need a second quality systems person to support the consulting implementation, and I need to hire that person and train them before we start the Tier 2 work, and the second shift is hitting a throughput ceiling on the Category 9 components that Jimmy and I have been going back and forth on for 2 weeks. He paused. "The deal is done. The work is what it is." Martin shook his head slowly. "You are a genuinely strange person, Ryan." "Probably," Ryan agreed. Martin stood, gathered the portfolio, and then stopped at the conference room door. "I want to say something." "Okay." "When you called me, that night, almost 2 years ago, late, with the legal pad and the folder, and the whole thing." Martin looked at him directly. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've had maybe 4 conversations in that entire time with people who were describing something real rather than something they wanted to be real." He paused. "That was one of them." Ryan looked at him. "I'm not saying it for credit. Martin added. I made a good investment. I'm saying it because the thing you built here, the facility, but also the way you built it, the people, the whole thing, it deserved to exist. And it exists because you were stubborn enough and careful enough to make it exist. A brief pause. That's not nothing. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Thanks, Martin. Don't get sentimental. I'll send the invoice by end of week. Ryan laughed, and Martin left, and the building settled back into the sound of itself. The floor running, people doing their work, the June afternoon visible through the loading dock doors where the light was doing the particular thing Ohio light does in early summer when the sky is clear and the air hasn't gotten heavy yet. He sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes. He did this sometimes. Took a few minutes of quiet in the middle of a day because the day didn't naturally provide them, and he'd learned in the years of raising Emma while building something that quiet was not a luxury. It was maintenance. He thought about Sarah. He did this less often now than he had in the early years, and when he did it, no longer had the quality of grief that it once did. It had become something more like a conversation with an absence, a kind of checking in with the version of the future that didn't happen, and acknowledging, with something that was neither peace nor its absence, but somewhere in between, that the version that did happen was still worth the having. He thought she would have liked Patricia. He thought she would have been exasperated by the folding table and the squeaking chair and the absence of anything decorative in the conference room. She had been, in their years together, the person who made spaces feel inhabited, who put small things in rooms that made the rooms feel like someone lived in them rather than worked in them. He had not been good at that. He still wasn't. The conference room looked like what it was, a functional space for functional conversations, with a window that looked out on the floor that he was prouder of than he knew how to say. He thought Sarah would have understood that. She had known, better than most, the difference between what people showed and what they were actually doing. He got up and went back to work. The implementation work began in July. Patricia took the consulting lead, which had always been the plan, and approached the first Sterling facility with the same adversarial thoroughness she brought to her own systems, looking for every way the process could fail before it failed on its own. Sandra Foley was at that first Sterling facility, and the dynamic between her and Patricia was, from Ryan's occasional check-ins, the productive version of difficult rather than the destructive version. They disagreed about implementation sequence. They disagreed about documentation standards. They agreed from the beginning and without discussion that the standard itself was not negotiable, which turned out to be the only agreement that mattered. 3 months into the implementation, Sandra called Ryan directly. She had his number from the contract process. I want to tell you something, she said. Go ahead. The quality metrics at the Henderson facility, that's the first Sterling plant we've been working with, have shifted. In 3 months, the incoming inspection failure rate has dropped by 31%. A pause. That's not a small number. No, Ryan said. It's not. Your systems work, Sandra said. It was not a compliment in the usual sense. It was an assessment by someone who had been looking at manufacturing quality systems for 15 years and had been skeptical in the specific way of experienced people evaluating unfamiliar approaches. I've been in this industry a long time, and I want to be honest. When I first looked at the tolerance control architecture, I thought there were elements that were theoretically elegant but practically unworkable at production scale. I know, Ryan said. That's the most common reaction. I was wrong, she said. I wanted you to hear that directly rather than through your partner or through the contract reporting. Thank you, Sandra. That means something. A brief pause. Miss Owens is very good. I know. She's also very direct. I know that too, Ryan said. He heard something that might have been Sandra Foley smiling. She reminds me of myself 20 years ago, before I learned to sand the edges down. Don't tell her that, Ryan said. She'll consider the sanding a personal failing. Sandra laughed. A real one. I won't. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. He hung up and thought about what she'd said, about being wrong and saying so directly, about the metrics at Henderson. He walked out onto the HPM floor and found Patricia at the quality station, in her usual position, doing what she always did. Sandra Foley called, he said. Patricia looked up. 31% reduction in the incoming failure rate at Henderson, 3 months in. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the measurement log in front of her, then back up. The documentation sequencing helped, she said. The operators there needed a different order than what their original system had. It's a process logic issue, not a capability issue. She said you were very direct. I'm always direct. She meant it as a compliment. Patricia considered this. Okay. Ryan stood there for a moment. You know what you've built here, right? Not just here. What you took to Henderson. What you're building into Sterling's operations. Patricia looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether a statement required a response or whether it would be better to let it settle on its own. I know what I built, she said. I built what the work needed. Yeah, Ryan said. That's it exactly. She went back to the log. Ryan went back to the floor. August came with the kind of heat that sits on the Ohio Valley like a decision that's been made and won't be reconsidered. The second shift was running at full utilization. The Halcyon category expansion had been delivering for 6 months, and the quality data had not degraded with the volume increase, which was the test Ryan had been watching for, because that was where most facilities that built on ambition rather than architecture eventually showed the cracks. The cracks didn't show. Dale, who had been in manufacturing for 30 years and had seen every version of a facility that looks good at the beginning and stops looking good under pressure, stopped Ryan one afternoon in the parking lot, the way Dale always chose to have real conversations, out of earshot of the floor, and said, I want to tell you something. Tell me, Ryan said. When you called me, that first phone call. Dale looked at the facility entrance, not at Ryan. I was at the lumberyard. I'd been at the lumberyard for 2 years. I came home every night with sawdust in my hair, and my wife didn't say anything about it because she knew I'd quit if she said anything about it. Ryan waited. I almost didn't answer the phone, Dale said. I'd had calls before, recruiting things, temporary positions, stuff that didn't pan out. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad you didn't. I know. Dale finally looked at him. I want you to know what you gave back, not just the job, what the job means. He stopped, and Ryan recognized the moment. The same one from the first phone call, the allergies that weren't allergies. I'm not going to make it a thing. Okay, Ryan said, but I wanted you to know. I know, Dale, Ryan said. I know. Dale nodded once, with finality, the way he ended statements that had been fully made, and went back inside. Ryan stood in the parking lot for a moment. The August heat was real and immediate. The Japanese maple near the entrance, Patricia's maple, technically, though the question of ownership had never been formally discussed, was full and green and entirely unbothered by the summer. He had something to do that he'd been putting off for 4 months. He drove to Decker Avenue. The shop was open. Trevor was inside, working on a pump repair, and looked up when Ryan came in. Hey, wasn't expecting you till Thursday. Just stopping by, Ryan said. I need to measure something. He went outside and stood in front of the sign. It was bad. He'd always known it was bad, but standing in front of it now, in the August afternoon, it was more specifically bad than he'd let himself think about. The paint had faded unevenly. The letters had cracked in the heat over multiple summers. The mounting hardware was rusted at 2 of the 4 anchor points. It looked like a sign that had been meaning to be replaced for approximately forever. He got the measurements. He took a photograph of the current sign. He stood back and looked at the building. The 2 bays, the small office, the parking lot with its patchwork of old asphalt and newer concrete, the window that fogged in winter and stuck in summer. He thought about what it had been, what it still was in some fundamental sense. He drove back to HPM. He sat at the conference room table with a piece of paper and a pen and wrote down options for what the new sign should say. Holloway Machine Repair. What it had always said faded to near invisibility. Holloway Repair and Fabrication. Accurate but broader than what the shop actually did. Holloway Industrial Services. Martin had suggested something like this once, in passing, as a way to create brand alignment between the shop and HPM. Ryan had said he'd think about it and not thought about it. He crossed all of them out. He sat there for a while. Then he wrote one word on the paper. Holloway. He looked at it. No descriptor, no category, no explanation of what services were offered or what specializations were available or what the building inside was for. Just the name. The name that was also on the facility on Commerce Boulevard, on 17 patents, on the contracts with Halcyon and Meridian, and now on the first-tier agreement with Sterling Industrial. The name that Emma had written in large, uneven letters on a crayon drawing as Holloway when she was 6. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. The sign was installed on a Saturday in September, when the heat had finally broken and the morning had the first actual crispness of approaching fall. Ryan had arranged it with a local sign company. A clean, simple installation, navy lettering on white, the letters themselves large enough to read from the street, but not aggressive about it. Emma came with him. She stood in the parking lot in her weekend clothes, jeans and a sweatshirt with a cartoon of a periodic table on it that she had chosen herself from a science museum gift shop, and looked at the new sign with her hands on her hips. "Just your name?" she said. "Just the name," Ryan said. She considered it. "Why not Holloway Repair or something, so people know what it is?" "People who need it will know what it is," Ryan said. "The ones who don't know, the sign won't tell them anyway." She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether an adult's reasoning made sense or was the kind of thing adults said when they'd made a decision and didn't want to fully explain it. "I think it looks good," she said finally. "Clean." "That's what I thought." She looked at it for another moment. Then, "Is your name on the factory too?" HPM Holloway Precision Manufacturing. "Yeah." "And on the patents?" "Yes." "And on the—" She counted on her fingers. "The Halcyon thing and the Sterling thing and the Meridian thing? How do you know about those?" "I listen," she said simply. Ryan looked at his daughter. 8 years old, her mother's directness fully intact and apparently accelerating, standing in the September morning looking at a sign that said one word and understanding, in the particular way she had of understanding things, what it meant. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said. Not performatively, just as a fact, offered in the same tone she offered most facts, directly, without decoration, in the expectation that it would be received as stated. Ryan looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "Thank you." She nodded once, satisfied, and looked back at the sign. "Can we get breakfast? I want the place with the pancakes that are too big." "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." They got in the truck and drove to the place with the pancakes that were too big, and Emma ate more than was reasonable for a person of her size, and told him about a book she'd started about a girl who builds bridges, and whether bridges and factories use the same kind of engineering, and whether if she became an engineer she would have to pick one or could she do both. "You can do both," Ryan said. "How do you know?" "Because the principles are the same. You learn the principles and then you apply them to whatever you're building." She thought about this, with a piece of pancake on her fork. "What are the principles?" "That's the long answer," Ryan said. "I have time," she said. He looked at her. She was watching him with the patient, expectant attention she brought to things she actually wanted to know, which was different from the polite attention she brought to things adults felt compelled to explain. Ryan drank his coffee. He thought about where to start. He thought about a folding conference room table and a 47-page report, and an abandoned building with the right bones. He thought about Patricia at a checkout lane and Jimmy at a car wash and Dale with sawdust in his hair. He thought about a line starting up at 6:14 on a January morning and the measurement data coming back clean. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer making a face she didn't know he'd seen, and then coming back months later to the building she'd let deteriorate, to sit across from the man she'd dismissed and look at what he'd done with it and say I was wrong without finding a softer way to say it. He thought about what all of it had cost and what it had made, and whether there was a version of those two things you could separate from each other. And he thought the answer was no, that the cost and the making were part of the same thing, and that trying to have one without the other was the mistake most people made when they were trying to understand why some things lasted and others didn't. "The first principle," he said, "is that you build for the work, not for how the work looks." Emma put the piece of pancake in her mouth. "What's the second?" "You hire people who are better at things than you are, and then you let them be better." "What's the third?" "You don't stop when it gets hard, you adjust and you keep going." She was quiet for a moment, chewing. Then, "Those seem more like rules than principles." Ryan looked at her. "What's the difference?" "Rules are what you do," she said. "Principles are why." He sat back. She was right. She was, at 8, completely right. and she'd caught it in about 4 seconds. "Okay," he said. "The principle is that the work matters more than the recognition, that what you build has to be real, not just impressive, not just successful by someone else's measurement, but actually real, actually sound, actually worth the time of the people who build it and use it and depend on it." "You want?" He paused. "Everything else follows from that. If the work is real, the recognition comes or it doesn't, and it doesn't change what the work is. If the work isn't real, the recognition doesn't fix it." Emma looked at him with the focused consideration she gave things that she was actually absorbing. "Is that what you did? Built something real?" "I tried to," Ryan said. "Do you think you did?" He thought about the measurement data, about Patricia's clipboard, about Dale's allergies, about Sandra Foley calling him on a Tuesday to say she'd been wrong and the systems worked, about Emma, at 7, telling a waitress that her dad owned a factory, saying it with no qualification, no performance, just the straightforward fact of a child who had watched something happen and understood what it was. "Yeah," Ryan said. "I think so." She nodded and went back to her pancakes, satisfied, the way she was satisfied when she'd gotten the real answer rather than the managed one. Outside the diner window, Millhaven moved through its Saturday morning, people walking, a delivery truck double parked on the main street, a couple of kids on bicycles that were slightly too big for them. The particular ordinary motion of a town that had been through difficult things and was still here, still running, still doing what towns do when they've decided to keep going. Ryan finished his coffee. The sign on the shop on Decker Avenue said one word. The facility on Commerce Boulevard was running a second shift. Somewhere in 2 Sterling industrial facilities, quality systems that Patricia had built were changing the numbers in ways that would take months to fully appear in the data but were already visible to the people who knew where to look. And across a folding table in a small conference room in a building that had once been overgrown with weeds, a woman who had laughed at a rusted sign and an old truck had sat down and said, "I was wrong and meant it," and something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was in the same general direction, had passed between 2 people who had both built things they were proud of and had more building left to do. None of it was clean. None of it was the story that wrote itself simply in anyone's head. Not Ryan's, not Isabella's, not the version that would eventually show up in that industry trade publication piece that Ryan would agree to, finally, the following spring, after Patricia told him for the 4th time that visibility was not the enemy. It was messier than a clean story and more real than a simple one, and the mess was part of what made it worth the having. Ryan left the tip on the table, a generous one, because he'd worked enough jobs in his life to know that the people who brought you your coffee deserved to know their work was seen. He held the door for Emma, and she walked out into the September morning with her hands in her sweatshirt pockets and her face turned up slightly to the light, the way she did when the weather was doing something she approved of. They drove back toward home through the part of Millhaven where the streets were named after trees and the houses had front porches, and the neighborhood had the particular character of a place that had absorbed hard years without entirely losing what it had been. Ryan drove and said nothing, and let the morning be what it was. Emma looked out the window for a while. Then she said, without preamble, "I'm going to build bridges and factories." "Okay," Ryan said. "And maybe also the machines that build bridges and factories. That's ambitious." "You built a whole factory," she said. "That was ambitious." "Fair point," he said. She looked back out the window. A mile later, she said, "I think I want a dog." Ryan glanced at her. "You've been wanting a dog for 2 years," he said. "I know, I think I'm ready now." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Martin Lau in the early days, looking at Emma's crayon drawing on the corner of the conference room desk. The house, the large-headed figure, the animal of uncertain species. "Maybe you should get one," Martin had said. "We'll talk about it," Ryan said. "That means yes," Emma said. "That means we'll talk about it," Ryan said. But they both knew what it meant. He drove home through the September morning, and the town went past the windows, and the sign on Decker Avenue said one word, and the factory on Commerce Boulevard was running, and the work that had always been the point, the work that had been the reason and the proof and the argument and the answer, the work continued, the way real things continue, quietly, without announcement, In the hands of people who understood what they were doing and why it mattered and weren't waiting for anyone's permission to keep going.